Hey, comrade, you expect us to believe this BS?
Kirby shouted out sarcastically, interrupting the presentation. Alexei glared at Kirby from the corner of his eyes, refusing to turn his head away from the rest of those in attendance. Kirby was laughing while leaning back in his chair and propping his feet up on the long meeting room table that sat perpendicular to Alexei and the projector screen. Mark Kirby, the American, or just Kirby, as most of the team referred to him as. When Moscow decided to bring other countries in on the situation, Alexei wouldn't have guessed someone like him would be selected to join the team. Alexei closed his eyes, taking a deep breath before exhaling loudly, obviously annoyed with the request.
As I was saying,
he opened his eyes, meeting Kirby's gaze.
The Americans didn't make it to the moon first.
Kirby waved his hand dismissively, as if to say, "You're full of it." Alexei smiled slightly, probably unnoticeable to the 4 audience members, before continuing.
Long before Neil Armstrong took his historic steps on a lunar surface, humanity had already reached the moon through the remarkable Soviet Lunar program. Between 1959 and 1976, this ambitious initiative deployed a series of probes that vastly expanded our knowledge of Earth's celestial companion. Luna 1 kicked off the program with the first successful lunar flyby, while the groundbreaking Luna 2 probe made history as the first human artifact to touch the moon, crashing near the Sea of Serenity on September 14, 1959. Later that year, the Luna 3 probe took the first photographs of the far side of the moon. Finally, in 1966, Luna 9 accomplished the extraordinary feat of softly landing on the moon, transmitting the first detailed close-up images of the captivating lunar landscape.
I am sorry, but were we brought here just for a lesson in Soviet accomplishments? We already know all of this. The space race has been the most widely publicized pissing contest ever,
Georgina said, hand raised.
Certainly, all of this information is well known to the public. However, what you may not have heard through conventional news sources is that when our researchers meticulously examined the photos captured by Luna 3, they made a startling and seemingly impossible discovery. To their astonishment, they observed what appeared to be a cave entrance within a crater, with light mysteriously emanating from its opening. Naturally, this was initially assumed to be a result of a technical malfunction or some other explainable phenomenon. Regardless, our team was determined to investigate further.
Alexei proceeded to the next slide, which displayed intricate charts filled with trajectories, schematics, and an array of complex equations.
Lunar 9's launch included an additional payload, a rover that was launched in secret. It successfully landed on the moon.
Alexei changed slides once again, revealing grainy photos of the moon's surface, only visible due to small lights located on the rover.
Incredible.
Yes, but why keep this from the world?
Asked Francois. Alexei pursed his lips thoughtfully, then clicked over to the final slide. Displayed were 2 images. The first showed the cave entrance, which was noticeably brighter than its surroundings, suggesting that the rover's own lights were being supplemented by an external source. The second image revealed a small, metallic sphere that emitted light through what appeared to be cracks on its surface. A hushed silence filled the room. Even Kirby, usually quick with a clever remark, found himself speechless, his once confident grin fading and his feet now firmly planted on the floor.
What is it?
Georgina asked, standing and approaching the screen for a better look.
We don't know,
Alexei said as he wheeled out a TV from behind the projector screen.
But wait, you said that we weren't the first on the moon. Are you implying that the Soviets already sent a team to investigate this anomaly?
In 1968, we launched the first manned mission to the lunar surface. 4 courageous cosmonauts embarked on a journey into the unknown to unravel its mysteries.
So, what happened?
Francois asked apprehensively. Alexei responded by inserting a tape into the built-in VCR on the TV. He stepped back, allowing the others to lean in, their eyes fixated on the screen. The screen flickered to life, revealing the unmistakable form of a lunar lander's capsule, captured through the grainy lens of a cosmonaut's helmet camera. The scene was already unnerving. Russian voices filled the airwaves, their tones tinged with panic. The helmet camera swiveled erratically, capturing glimpses of control panels, instruments, and the faces of 3 other cosmonauts. Their expressions were a mix of confusion and fear. Amidst the chaos, a whistling sound began to rise. Subtle but insistent. It had been there from the start, a background noise now growing too loud to ignore. Suddenly, the lander jolted as if struck by an unseen force, and the screen went black. When the image returned, the timestamp indicated a gap. 28 minutes had passed. The camera now showed the lunar lander from a distance, lying on its side in a disarray of lights and shadows and twisted metal. Moon dust floated in the void, and debris was scattered. A cosmonaut hung lifelessly from the capsule, his visor a spiderweb of cracks. The person behind the camera struggled to his feet, fumbling with his suit's light controls but finding them unresponsive. Carefully, he approached the downed lander, stepping over debris, only to stop dead in his tracks. The whistling sound returned, now clearly coming from his suit's internal communications system. He turned and began walking away from the wreckage, eventually reaching the edge of a large crater. Inside it, he saw the cave entrance from earlier images, faintly lit and revealing the moon's rugged surface. What's more, another cosmonaut was visible, dragging an unresponsive crew member toward the cave. The footage cut, and he was halfway down the crater. Cut again, and he was nearing the cave, the footage becoming increasingly garbled, almost as if resisting capture. Yet the whistling sound remained, now more haunting than ever. Entering the cave, the ambient light crescendoed, flooding the chamber in ethereal glows. The camera finally rested on a spherical object at the center of the cavern. A low-frequency hum, alien and unsettling, was picked up by the microphone. Distinct, yet unrelated to the whistling. With a sense of reverence, or perhaps desperation, the cosmonaut extended his hands toward the sphere. As his fingers made contact, the object's luminescent fissures flared to an unbearable intensity. A burst of light consumed the frame, turning the screen into a canvas of pure, blinding white. And then, as abruptly as it had all begun, the recording terminated. Alexei switched off the TV and took a seat, allowing the others time to process what they had just witnessed.
This is insane. What on earth was that thing? And those sounds? Did you hear them?
That's impossible. All of this is. Alexei, is this some kind of joke?
Kirby demanded, standing up and pushing his chair out from under him.
I assure you, it's not.
Alexei replied solemnly.
We do not take the deaths of these men lightly. They discovered something extraordinary. We are going to ensure that their sacrifices were not in vain. We will uncover what happened to the crew and document everything we can about the object. That is why you are all here, brought together for the benefit of all mankind in what may be our greatest discovery. Your countries have contributed scientists, technology, data, and you. Surely, you understand the magnitude of the situation.
You are right.
Francois interjected.
This is fascinating, but this footage is over 20 years old? How do we know we won't suffer the same fate as our predecessors?
Alexei rose to his feet and straightened his uniform.
We don't.
With that, he exited the room with Tatyana following closely behind. The team had been sitting in the room for about 20 minutes. A cart of food had been rolled in, and they were eating quietly.
Well, what do you all think?
Georgina asked, breaking the silence.
I think the comrade is full of crap.
Kirby scoffed.
Okay, well, that isn't helpful, Mark. Blatant anger certainly won't help us understand the situation any better than we do now.
Francois said, rubbing his face with his hands.
Kirby, I won't tell you how I know this, but didn't your NASA encounter a strange signal when your astronauts orbited the moon back in '69?
Kirby glanced at Georgina, debating whether or not to question her about the classified information she seemed to possess. He shrugged and leaned back.
Audio from the Apollo 10, which orbited the moon, contained what the astronauts on board described as music. Of course, we all thought they were just hearing interference or something, but the experts who analyzed the audio couldn't explain it.
Do you think this whistling is what your astronauts heard?
Kirby shrugged again, shaking his head.
Look, I don't know any more than you do about what's going on. I never even heard the recording from Apollo 10.
Just then, Alexei's voice projected over an intercom.
Okay, it's time to get you acquainted with your tools. Meet me in warehouse 3C.
The team exchanged glances for a moment before standing up and following one another out of the room. Alexei entered his cramped office, a sanctuary of organized chaos, and sat at his desk, lighting a cigarette with the practiced ease of long habit. Tatyana followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the room as if cataloging its contents for future reference. To the left, a disorganized bookshelf groaned under the weight of textbooks, encyclopedias, and loose papers. Some of the papers had surrendered to gravity, lying in defeated heaps on the floor. The room was dimly lit, the only sources of light being a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a desk lamp that cast a focused glow on Alexei's workspace. His desk was a fortress of paperwork and analog equipment, with a chair on either side. To the right, a large chalkboard covered in cryptic writings and diagrams bore the hallmarks of a scientist's lair. However, Alexei was no scientist. He was a former KGB agent, reassigned to lead this boots-on-the-ground team due to his piloting experience, his reputation for ruthless efficiency in Moscow, and his unwavering loyalty to the Soviet Union.
What do you think?
Alexei asked, flipping through some dossiers while taking a drag from his cigarette.
About what, Comrade Aksynov?
Tatyana asked.
About the team.
As she took a seat, Alexei couldn't help but glance up at her. Tatyana was a study in contrasts. Her youthful face belied the intensity of her gaze, and her posture was impeccably professional. Yet there was an air of restless energy about her. She was a paradox that intrigued him, a puzzle that defied easy categorization. And in that moment, he realized that she was as much a part of this mission's unpredictability as the foreign team members they were discussing.
In that case...
She looked down at her clipboard, on which she had been taking meticulous notes throughout the briefing.
Georgina Metz, age 32, studied medicine at Harvard University. Smart, confident, calculating. She's actually quite impressive. Have you ever read her research paper on...
Alexei waved at her to continue. She flipped to the next page.
Francois Leblanc, age 48, mechanical engineer. The University of Cambridge. Joined the French National Center of Space Studies 18 years ago. Quiet, intuitive, and ready to be led. He loves his country and will do anything asked of him.
Turning to the last page, she continued.
Mark Kirby. Age 33. Mining and mineral engineer and U.S. Army officer. Crass, hard-headed, and untrusting of the Soviet Union. But he's damn good at what he does.
Tatyana flipped back to the first page and handed her clipboard to Aleksei, smiling to herself. He thanked her and examined the notes, comparing them to the official dossiers for a few minutes. His eyes lifted from the paper to meet hers, and he was struck again by the earnestness in her expression. Setting the clipboard aside, he checked his watch and paused for a moment before asking,
Comrade Markov, why are you here?
She seemed taken aback by the question, her eyes searching his for a clue to his intentions. Was he questioning her qualifications, her age, her experience?
As you know,
She stammered.
I was the one who translated the text. Linguists and anthropologists all over the Union couldn't, but I did. What if you encounter more writings? You need me. Not here, but there. I want to be there. The others have skills, sure, but they don't understand as I do. I mean, we haven't even told them.
She trailed off before continuing.
I want to do this for the Union. For, as you say, the benefit of all mankind.
She fell silent, her eyes locked onto his, as if trying to read his thoughts. He shook his head slightly.
No, comrade. Why are you here?
He gestured to the chair she was sitting in.
It's 5:45 p.m. You were supposed to get the team to Warehouse 3C.
She clasped her hand over her mouth.
Vot termo!
Alexei snuffed out his cigarette with 3 quick jabs into his ashtray before picking up the phone on his desk and dialing. Tatyana stood and quickly left the room, her heels clicking against the floor as she hurried away. As she did, Alexei spoke over the intercom.
Okay, it's time to get you acquainted with your tools. Meet me in Warehouse 3C.
Tatyana quickened her pace, her mind racing as she navigated the labyrinthian corridors, determined to reach the warehouse and gather the team for their next briefing. Francois, Georgina, and Kirby navigated the hallways of the sprawling facility, their eyes darting to the signs that promised to lead them to Warehouse 3C. The complex was a behemoth, a maze of concrete and steel that seemed to stretch on forever. The last thing they wanted was to waste precious time lost in its bowels, retracing their steps like characters in some Kafkaesque nightmare.
I wish they had at least sent someone to escort us.
Francois mused aloud, his voice tinged with a blend of irritation and apprehension as they continued their trek through the seemingly interminable corridors. As they walked, Francois felt his thoughts drift back, like leaves caught in a gust of wind, to the whirlwind of events that had deposited him in this alien landscape. Just 16 hours ago, he had been ensconced in the warm cocoon of his 2-bedroom apartment, sleeping soundly beside his wife, Elizabeth. The world outside had been a distant murmur, irrelevant and remote. Then came the knock, a sharp, incessant rap that shattered the tranquility of the night and jolted him awake. The sound reverberated through the apartment, startling his infant daughter Marie into a fit of crying. Elizabeth, her eyes heavy with sleep, sat up and began to rock the crib in a futile attempt to calm their distressed child. Frustrated and disoriented, Francois crossed the apartment in a few quick strides and opened the door. He was met by the stern faces of two men in military uniforms, their expressions unreadable, but their posture radiating urgency. One of the men thrust a piece of paper into his hands, while the other spoke in a tone that brooked no argument. "Francois Leblanc?"
Yes?
Francois stammered, his eyes darting from the men to the paper and back again. "You are to come with us. You have been selected to participate in a top-secret mission in collaboration with the other countries on behalf of France and the National Center for Space Studies. Pack a single bag of essentials and meet us outside." Without another word, the men turned on their heels and walked away, leaving Francois standing in the doorway, paper in hand, utterly dumbfounded. His eyes scanned the document again, searching for some clue, some hidden meaning. But the paper was maddeningly sparse, bearing only an official order from the president himself, co-signed by the head of the NCSS. No explanations, no details, just a command. Within minutes, Francois found himself packed and standing in his living room, facing his wife and daughter. Elizabeth's eyes were red, her face a mask of confusion and sorrow.
How can they just make you leave here for me? Your newborn daughter! How can they just take you away in the middle of the night?
She sobbed, her voice tinged with a mixture of anger and despair.
They wouldn't be here if it weren't tremendously important.
Francois tried to reassure her, though he felt the hollowness of his own words.
They probably just need some emergency consulting regarding some sort of experimental tech they're working on with NASA or something. Don't worry, my love. I'll be back soon. Everything is okay. Je vous t'aime.
With a heavy heart, he kissed his wife, whispered a goodbye to his still crying daughter, and stepped out into the cold night. The subsequent journey to the airfield was a blur, a disorienting whirl of motion and emotion. As he was ushered aboard a military transport plane, Francois felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. He was surrounded by other personnel, each wearing an expression of bewildered resignation, and crates of mysterious equipment that hinted at the gravity of their mission. This was clearly more serious than he had initially thought. Had he lied to his wife and to himself when he said that there was nothing to worry about? Francois leaned back in his chair and buckled in, his mind a swirl of conflicting emotions. He tried to shake the thoughts from his head, to focus on the task at hand. He was ready to serve his country, to do whatever was asked of him. But as the plane's engines roared to life, propelling him into an uncertain future, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had irrevocably changed, that the world he had known was receding into the distance, becoming smaller and smaller, until it was nothing but a speck on the horizon.
Hello, Earth to Francois.
Georgina's voice broke through Francois' reverie, like a ray of sunlight piercing through clouds. She tapped him gently on the shoulder, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of curiosity and concern.
Oh, sorry. What was that?
Francois blinked, his thoughts reluctantly detaching from the distant world of his family and snapping back to the present moment.
Do you have anyone back home?
Yes, wife and daughter.
I bet they're very proud of you.
Georgina mused, her eyes momentarily clouding over as she pondered the warmth of having someone back home who cared. She glanced over to ask Francois another question, but he seemed to have retreated back into his own thoughts. Sensing that now was not the time for further inquiry, she decided to leave him be. After a few more minutes of walking, they turned a corner and found themselves in another long hallway. This one was different, though. The walls were made of aged brick, and the floor was a dark, almost foreboding concrete. It felt like stepping into a different era, a relic from a time long past. Their assurance that they were in the right place came when they saw Tatyana energetically waving them over to one of the doors, about a third of the way down the corridor.
Привет! Сюда!
Tatyana called out, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. The group quickened their pace, and Tatyana ushered them into the room. As they stepped inside, Georgina felt her breath catch in her throat. She had expected a cramped, cluttered warehouse, a jumble of crates, shelves, and mechanical detritus. Instead, she found herself in a cavernous space, so vast it could rival a football stadium. Near the entrance were a few tables and crates, but what truly captured her attention was the spectacle at the center of the room. A lunar lander, a moon rover, and a rocket, standing like a monument to human ingenuity. It was a staggering realization. The Soviets had not only built this colossal facility in the remote Siberian wilderness, but they had also done so with astonishing speed. The group congregated around the tables where Tatyana was joined by a tall, lanky scientist who looked as if he had been plucked straight from a research lab.
Everyone, this is Dr. Maxwell. He led the development team for everything you'll see here today.
Dr. Maxwell extended his hand, his grip firm and his eyes alight with a sort of restrained excitement.
It's nice to meet you. Let's get to it.
What followed was a detailed exposition on the laser pistols before them, a narrative that seemed to blend science fiction with historical fact. The group listened in rapt attention, their minds struggling to absorb the enormity of what they were hearing.
The Soviet Union began experimenting with lasers in the 50s and 60s. Its first laser weapons, emerging in the 70s, were fixed ground-based systems, Terra 3 and Omega. Terra 3 consisted of two different devices, installed in Kazakhstan and initially conceived in the 1960s to swat down ballistic missiles in the terminal descending phase. The concurrently developed Omega lasers were intended to hit aircrafts and missiles in the atmosphere. Omega 1 and 2 proved more successful at striking distant targets, but the system still lacked sufficient hitting power and power generation. Designing a laser that could maintain a power-efficient beam over long distances is difficult. So perhaps, I thought, the solution was to get up close. In 1984, my team developed a laser pistol, a precursor to what you see before you today. It was intended for use by cosmonauts to damage the optics of Western satellites or blind hostile astronauts, without causing hull damage to a spacecraft. Each pull of the trigger electrically discharges a pyrotechnic flashbulb cartridge stored in an 8-round box magazine. However, the laser pistols inflicted very light damage, between 1 and 10 joules of energy, equivalent to an air gun, and had an effective range of only 20 meters. The design did not advance beyond the prototype stage, or so we reported. Here, at this facility, we continued our work and have created what you see before you, a true laser pistol, capable of viable use in combat.
When Dr. Maxwell concluded, a heavy silence hung in the air, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Once again, as with the footage from the moon, the group was left speechless.
As you can see, we do great work here.
Tatyana finally broke the silence, her voice tinged with pride. Kirby was the first to shake off the stupor.
Hell yes. This is awesome. I can't wait to tell the crew back in the States about this.
He exclaimed, grabbing one of the pistols and aiming it playfully at a stack of crates. Georgina, too, was intrigued, but her scientific mind couldn't help but probe further.
This is truly remarkable, Doctor. Why are they so large, though? Won't these be difficult to carry and handle?
We constructed this with your EVA suits and the moon's lesser gravity in mind. The pistols will rest snugly in your gloved hands, and the weight will not be an issue. The size is due to our current technological limitations, which prevent us from making them more compact. However, an additional feature of this device is that, since these are not projectile-based weapons, there is no recoil to worry about. Truly, the best defense a cosmonaut could ask for. Well, aside from the suit.
Dr. Maxwell said. Georgina took a step back, her eyes narrowing as she processed the implications.
Wait. Are you all expecting we will need to use these?
She directed her question at Tatyana, but it was Alexei who answered as he made his entrance into the warehouse.
Better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it,
Alexei declared, his voice carrying the weight of experience and authority.
After all, we wouldn't want to equip our heroes with anything but the best. That is true Soviet hospitality.
Dr. Maxwell chimed in, nodding towards Alexei as if to underscore the point.
Regardless, these pistols have uses beyond that of a traditional pistol. They can work to cut or heat objects and can even create small holes through rock and minerals with enough shots.
Alexei shifted the conversation, his eyes scanning the room.
Have we given them a rundown of their transportation?
We were just about to, Comrade Aksynov.
The group moved in unison towards the center of the room, where the lunar lander, rover, and rocket stood. Georgina's eyes were drawn to the large metal box affixed to the back of the rover, and the long barrel that extended from it. It looked incongruous, almost like an afterthought. Georgina inquired about their purpose. Her curiosity piqued.
That, Frau Metz, is for Mr. Kirby, a drill capable of cutting through the toughest materials we know of. It is possible a cave-in occurred after the immense release of energy you all saw on that tape. This is how you will regain access to the artifact's chamber, if that indeed did happen.
Dr. Maxwell explained. Alexei cut in, his voice tinged with impatience.
Enough about that. We will run through various scenarios and training for both of these. We need each of you to be able to confidently operate and troubleshoot them in case something goes wrong.
And what about the shuttle itself?
Alexei shook his head.
I am the pilot. It would take too long to train you all on how to operate it. Besides, this gives us some assurances.
What assurances?
Kirby's voice carried a note of skepticism. Georgina answered before Alexei could, her eyes meeting his as she spoke.
He means that it ensures his safety. That we protect his life by any means necessary. Because without him, none of us are going home.
She said, crossing her arms as if to physically shield herself from the enormity of the mission. She hadn't decided if she trusted Alexei yet, but she couldn't deny the gravity he brought into the room.
What have I got myself into?
She thought. Alexei began removing his coat, handing it to Dr. Maxwell as if shedding a layer of civilian life.
All right, it's time to suit up and begin your training. This mission is on a tight schedule, and I will not throw things off track with idle chit-chat. This is too important.
Once again, Georgina couldn't resist probing further.
Important for whom, Alexei? You? Your scientists? Moscow?
Alexei locked eyes with her, his gaze unwavering.
This mission is bigger than any of us. It is vitally important that we accomplish what we are setting out to do. Find our lost team and regain access to the artifact. Not for me, not for us, for the benefit of all mankind.
Alexei's final words reverberated through the room, settling into the core of each team member. For Georgina, it was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the staggering scope of their mission. They were not merely on the threshold of a new venture. They stood at the edge of a precipice, overlooking a chasm filled with both peril and promise. Every decision they made, every action they took, would echo through the corridors of history. In the days that followed, the team was plunged into a crucible of relentless training. They simulated countless scenarios, from equipment malfunctions to communication breakdowns, each exercise designed to test their mettle and forge them into a cohesive unit. Alexei presided over these sessions with the stern focus of a master conductor, his unwavering dedication serving as a constant, almost palpable force that drove them to exceed their own expectations. It was as if he were shaping them, not just into skilled operatives, skilled astronauts, but into the heroes the mission demanded. As they navigated this grueling regimen, something remarkable happened. The walls that had initially separated them, walls built from the bricks of nationality, ideology, and personal history, began to crumble. In their place rose the foundations of a genuine camaraderie, fortified by a shared sense of purpose that transcended their individual identities. They came to realize, to an extent, that their mission had the potential to be a transformative moment for humanity, a unifying achievement that could eclipse the divisions of nation and creed. And in that realization, the team found not just common ground, but a common destiny. But they were yet to know the full story. A loud ringing filled Aleksei's ears, and darkness enveloped his vision. He tried to move, but an immense weight held him down, making breathing nearly impossible. His inability to move was terrifying. Gradually, the weight above him shifted and lightened. Two men, along with Dr. Maxwell, finally managed to pull the largest piece of concrete off of Aleksei.
What? What just happened?
Alexei gasped, pushing debris off of his chest and grasping Dr. Maxwell's hand.
Same as in 1908, a massive airburst. The team and the objects closest to the deliverer have seemingly been vaporized.
Dr. Maxwell explained, helping the shaken Russian to his feet.
No. What caused this? I thought we figured it out. What went wrong?
Alexei demanded answers, aware that Dr. Maxwell couldn't possibly have them. Alexei surveyed the scene through the destroyed wall of the bunker they had been using as an observation post. The spherical object designated Deliverer by the team sat on the ground amidst chaos. The research camp surrounding the object had been hit by an airburst, with unprecedented winds, and an initial blast surpassing the destructive force of a few thousand tons of TNT. Tents, supplies, trucks, and bodies were strewn about. Observation teams stationed at the camp's far perimeter had begun attending to the wounded, bagging the bodies, and retrieving research materials and supplies.
This is a travesty,
Dr. Maxwell whispered. Alexei turned away from the scene and sat on an overturned barrel that once held their drinking water. Now nearly empty, it leaked through a dozen holes created by rocks during the blast.
52 years and still no progress. The Tunguska event was a catastrophe I promised myself would never happen again when I took over 3 years ago.
He rubbed a cut on his forehead and examined the blood on his fingers.
This isn't your fault or anyone's fault. We are simply dealing with technology centuries beyond our understanding. We can't give up. We clean up and start again.
We are out of time. We don't have another 50 years. If we are correct, we only have 30 years until everything's gone. Based on your calculations, the year 2000 will bring a cosmic event unlike any humanity has seen. According to Comrade Markov's translation, this event will wipe us out. Don't you understand, Doctor? We are working to save the human race. We cannot fail again. We cannot.
Silence fell over the destroyed bunker for a few minutes, broken only by the sounds from the camp's center. Shouts echoed off the walls, orders barked by cleanup crews, and cries of pain from the wounded.
Doctor, I believe it's time to loop you into something,
Alexei said, locking eyes with Dr. Maxwell.
Last year, our Luna 2 probe detected a frequency similar to the Deliverer's, emanating from a moon crater. We believe there is another device. A team is working to confirm our theory as we speak.
Really? That's incredible. I wonder how many there are. Could that mean other planets and moons in our solar system have them too? This would mean those who built them expanded beyond their home planet. Perhaps Earth isn't even their origin.
Doctor,
Alexei snapped his fingers, pulling Dr. Maxwell from his thoughts.
Sorry, you mentioned a team hoping to confirm this. How would they do that?
Dr. Maxwell inquired.
we plan to land a rover on the moon, followed by boots on the ground if we get confirmation. Maybe this device can be retrieved or interacted with, providing us with new insight into what must be done.
Maybe it isn't another device at all, but something else of theirs entirely.
Dr. Maxwell mused, gazing up at the sky.
The point is, we cannot put all our eggs in one basket. A team will remain here and continue doing what they can. I will take you with me to lead our research and development team for the moon missions.
I'm sure beating the Americans to the moon would earn you a nice medal.
The public will know about these. Our actions will only mean something if we succeed in saving the human race.
Alexei stood up, taking a cigarette from the case in his inner jacket pocket and glancing at Dr. Maxwell, who appeared lost in grim thoughts about the consequences of failure. Alexei lit his cigarette and took a drag before speaking.
Hey Doc, you aren't afraid of flying, are you?
Dr. Maxwell looked at him with confusion before shaking his head.
Good, because you'll be joining them. You'll be one of the first humans to set foot on the moon.
Can that whistling just shut up already?
Dr. Maxwell exclaimed as he climbed out of the crashed lunar lander. He spun around to help his fellow cosmonaut, Vikov, who was still in the seat next to him. The whistling sound persisted, playing through his suit's comms system and the barely functioning audio equipment within the capsule.
Get up! Get up now!
Dr. Maxwell shouted as he grabbed Vikov's arms and tried to pull him out of the wrecked capsule.
Help me out here, damn it! This thing is falling apart. You must move!
He gave one more forceful tug, but lost his balance and toppled over onto his back, kicking up moon dust. He swatted at the dust in front of his visor and looked up at Vikov's motionless body hunched halfway out of the capsule. Vikov's visor was shattered. Blood droplets floated within his helmet, and his face was blue and swollen. His wide-open eyes stared directly back at Dr. Maxwell. Closing his eyes momentarily, he pushed himself up and scanned his surroundings for the others. The darkness made it difficult to see, and his suit's lights weren't functioning.
They must have been ejected elsewhere,
he thought to himself. He exhaled slowly, reflecting on the crash. They had been in close orbit around the moon, approaching their landing site near the cave suspected to house another alien object when the whistling sound began. Suddenly, their electronics malfunctioned, and they lost control. They crashed.
Hello? Hello? Anyone? This is Natalia. I was ejected from the capsule. I am not sure, but I think I'm just outside of the target location. Does anyone read me?
Natalia's voice broke the silence.
Natalia! Yes, hello. Are you okay?
Dr. Maxwell asked, relieved to hear her voice.
Oh, Ethan, thank God. I'm fine, but I can't find Vilko or Pavel.
She replied.
Vikov didn't make it. I haven't seen Pavel, but it's incredibly dark. If he's alive and awake, he'll know his only hope is to make it to our target. I'm on my way. Wait for me there.
Dr. Maxwell said as he oriented himself and headed towards Natalia and the crater. A few minutes later, Natalia's voice came through again, but she was whispering.
Ethan, something is wrong. Do you hear that? The whistling, it's gone. But listen.
Dr. Maxwell slowed his breathing and listened intently. He could hear what sounded like chanting.
What the hell's that?
He asked.
I don't know, but I hear it coming from inside the cave as well. They want me, Ethan. They want us to join them. Salvation, they say. You're all right, Ethan. They are here to help us. They are telling me so. We must go in.
Natalia's voice had changed. It sounded more fanatical.
Natalia, what are you talking about? It does sound odd, I admit. But it's not a voice,
he said, reaching the top of the crater and seeing Natalia standing at the mouth of the cave.
Just wait. I see you. I'll be down in just a moment.
As Dr. Maxwell made his way down the incline into the base of the crater, Natalia remained silent and motionless, staring into the cave opening, pulsing with light.
Natalia?
He called as he neared her, but she stayed silent.
Natalia, are your comms down?
He asked as he reached out his hand. Before he could touch her, she spun around with alarming speed, faster than she should have been able to move in the bulky spacesuit. He couldn't see her face through the reflective visor, but he knew something was wrong. Suddenly, she raised her arm and smashed his visor with a rock. He fell to the ground and began frantically clawing at his visor. The impact had caused a small crack. It must have been weakened on impact, and now his suit was slowly depressurizing.
Natalia! What the hell? Why?
He screamed as he kept one hand on his visor and tried to grab his emergency supplies from his chest pouch. She didn't respond, but grabbed him by the shoulders and started dragging him into the cave. He would have struggled, but he knew he had to prioritize fixing the leak first. As he continued fumbling around for his supply pouch, he saw a figure appear at the top of the crater. It had to be Pavel.
Thank God, he's alive,
he thought. But he knew Pavel's comms had to be malfunctioning. Communicating with him now would be impossible. Quickly, Natalia pulled him into the cave. She practically threw him towards the center. He climbed to his feet, one hand still on his visor. As he prepared to confront Natalia, he was left speechless by what he saw. Directly in front of him was the Deliverer. Not the same one from Earth, of course, but obviously the same sort of object. It was suspended in midair in the center of the cave. Natalia had her hands hovering just around it.
Don't you hear them, Ethan? It's time we join them.
As she touched the sphere, he was blinded by the bright light. Everything began to shake. The chanting, which he now realized truly was chanting, grew louder and louder. He blacked out. Everything had led to this moment, Georgina thought. In reality, everything in the past 2 weeks. In her heart, though, she was sure that it was her whole life that had been leading up to this very second of her existence. The spacesuit was suffocating, but nothing like the even bulkier model she would wear when they disembarked. She had spent so many hours of her life lately in that damned thing, and it seemed no different from putting on a shirt in the morning. Now, though, she could feel every seam, every crease, every cold metal zipper against her skin, as if everything was so much more present all of a sudden. She turned her head from side to side, trying to make the stranglehold of the helmet more comfortable, when Alexei's voice hissed over the in-suit intercom.
T-20 and holding. T-20 and holding.
Dr. Maxwell confirmed from the command center. Georgina thought that she could still get out of this, completely out of character for her stoic German demeanor. She could panic, throw a fit, become hysterical. They would have to pull her out, and she could go home. She could go home and be far away from this disaster in the making. But then she looks at Tatyana, young, brilliant, and beautiful Tatyana, strapped into her seat, her face pale but determined. From here, Georgina could also see the stubborn set of her teammate's jaw, and it settled her nerves. If Tatyana could be brave, so could Georgina.
Pre-flight alignments are confirmed.
Maxwell's voice informed them all.
Copy that.
Alexei replied.
T-minus 20 and counting. T-minus and 20 counting confirmed.
Behind her visor, she glared at the back of Alexei's head with all the suspicion she could muster. She wondered if he knew of her minor in psychology and how she had written paper upon paper about the behaviors of psychopaths and sociopaths. He was lying about something. She would bet money on it, but she wasn't sure what. Besides the things that Tatyana had told her, but oddly, she could almost understand why he held that close to his chest. Her suspicions came from the timbre of his voice, the slight tilt of his head when he spoke, and the rapid blinking when he was caught off guard. His demeanor, his obvious belief in his superiority, and his seeming disinterest in them as anything other than tools for the enormous machine that was this mission unsettled her. She didn't trust him. Not one bit. And she'd be damned if she left this mortal coil because some asshole was hiding some necessary piece of information. That damned fear was trying to creep up her throat again, and Georgina pushed it down as hard as she could. She was about to make history, for God's sake. She'd be damned if she wasn't remembered. They would write her name in history books. Little German girls would have posters of her above their beds, tacked into the drywall with little pink thumbtacks. In 20 minutes, her name would be a permanent part of the fabric of the world. Forever. If she could just keep her shit together. Georgina figured she must be having such a hard time with it now because she had been forcing all the fear and negativity away during the training. It was so exciting, unbelievably so, almost like some science fiction novel. She had watched that recording of the first moon mission and the sphere anomaly at least 50 times at this point, her eyes searching for any clue that she might have missed the first round. She had no desire for her bones to become part of the lunar surface after all. No one put up posters of dead astronauts. The rover had been something else. It was like maneuvering the least responsive car of all time, but she figured that was to be expected of something that had to be sturdy enough to make it to the moon. One of the few real bright spots in training had been watching Kirby learn to use the enormous drill, like a little boy with his first pellet gun. The age had fallen away from the American's face as he had drilled into all sorts of rocks and metals, often cackling joyfully as he did so. Men. They would never cease to amaze her. She had tried everything they had thrown at her, and she took some of it better than others. Her rover driving wasn't going to be her life's work. She was a crack shot with the laser pistol, scoring better than even Kirby, much to Tatyana's delight. Her specialty had been medicine, and she wondered what her expertise could do for the Russian space program. But after seeing the footage of the first landing, she had suddenly understood. It was her responsibility to keep this crew alive, no matter what this mission did to them, and more importantly, bring them back mentally and physically whole. It was a daunting prospect, but if anyone could do it, she could. She knew she could. She just had to keep convincing herself of that fact.
T-minus 9 minutes and holding.
Alexei's voice, crackling and electric, interrupts her thoughts again, followed by another confirmation from Dr. Maxwell. Georgina shut her eyes and focused on her breathing. Not the dull roar of the rocket beneath her. Not the overly trusting Russian woman next to her. And not the echo of chants, 2 decades old. Not the bodies of astronauts long dead. Bodies falling to dust in nearly empty suits, and bones longing for the dirt of their home. Nothing but her breathing. Nothing. 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 With a shuddering breath, she tried to slide into memory and grabbed onto the first one to float to the top, wanting to be anywhere but here. The dorms they had been put up in were anything but luxurious, but at least they had all gotten private rooms. there was a strict rule of no drugs, no alcohol, and no sex. Nothing to distract them from the mission. That didn't stop Georgina from knocking on Tatyana's door one night, a bottle of gut-rot vodka clutched in her hand. At first, it hadn't been because she was looking for any sort of female camaraderie from the Cosmonaut. Instead, she was desperate to know more about their commander, Aleksei, and what better person to ask than his right-hand woman. But with the first wrinkle of Tatyana's nose at the sight of the terrible vodka, Georgina should have known her plans were going out of the window. This girl made her laugh. Georgina ended up sprawled out on her bed, while Tatyana was sitting on the floor, leaning against the frame, while they passed the bottle back and forth, each of them coughing and cringing as they drank.
God, this is truly awful.
Tatyana groaned, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand.
Where did you even get this?
Don't worry about it.
Georgina insisted, with a wave of her hand.
Fair. I needed it enough that I don't really care where it came from.
Huh. That sounds ominous.
She sat up on her elbow to look down at the other woman.
What could drive Aleksei's favorite comrade to drink?
Tatyana hesitated, but said,
Alexei has been acting so strange. I don't know him very well, but I don't think his behavior would be normal for anyone, let alone the mission commander.
Strange how?
Well, he locks himself in his office for hours. But we can hear the recording of the chanting audio over and over again. Whenever I try to check up on him, he's so snappy and cruel. And he keeps telling me to mind my business. That he's the only one that understands this mission is for the betterment of all mankind. Whatever that means.
He looks like he hasn't slept in weeks. That's frightening. But I have to say I'm surprised he's taking it out on you. I figured you were the only one he really liked.
Tatyana shook her head.
No, he thinks I'm an idiot. Or at least that's the vibe I get from him. Even though without me, he would have no idea what those chants meant anyway.
Tatyana took a long pull from the vodka bottle and passed it behind her to Georgina. She hesitated before taking a drink herself, parsing over what Tatyana had said.
You translated them?
Yes.
Her voice was quiet.
The chants and the text.
She wrapped her arms around herself as if she was suddenly cold. She turned to look at Georgina, and the fear in her eyes struck her.
If I tell you what it said, you can't repeat it. Promise.
Georgina felt like she had sobered up immediately.
I promise.
The text described the cataclysmic cosmic event that occurs every few 100,000 years, the next being in the year 2000. They believed the race that left the devices did so to warn other races and give them the tools to save themselves. I know it sounds crazy, but...
Nothing seems crazy anymore, Tatyana. You might want to take another drink, though, before you shiver yourself to pieces.
Georgina kept herself put together on the outside, but inside she was reeling from the news. Another race? As in aliens? She couldn't even imagine, couldn't even fathom. All of that, combined with Alexei apparently obsessing over the chanting, left a horrible taste in Georgina's mouth. Of course, the device on the moon was suspect, but she couldn't force herself to truly believe this was extraterrestrial until she saw it with her own eyes. But there was undeniable dark energy all over this entire mission.
That's the real reason for this mission.
Tatyana continues, scrambling to sit next to Georgina on the scratchy blanket and taking the bottle from her hand.
Alexei doesn't want anyone else to know, because it's world-changing information. The explanation about retrieving the first mission's victims is a pretty story for the masses, but now you know the truth, just like me.
How do they even think they can use these sphere devices to save the world?
Georgina was baffled.
They cannot figure out how to use them, but they believe they can be used as gateways to other devices. So they want to travel to the so-called creators and ask for help.
Georgina pressed her fingers to her temple, trying to drive away a migraine building there.
I can't talk about this anymore, Tatyana. Can we talk about something else?
Pulling the bottle from her lips, Tatyana looked at Georgina with wide eyes, shocked that she didn't want to talk about the mission to anyone. After all, they had all been living and breathing this mission for weeks now.
What else is there?
You said you're a translator. What's the most interesting thing you've translated? Besides this, obviously.
Tatyana thought for a minute before she giggled.
Well, there was this ancient Egyptian text experts were sure was a description of the pyramid building process. But once I had deciphered it, we discovered it was a letter from a very unhappy man to his wife after being caught with another woman.
Tatyana told Georgina about how she had been creating and breaking codes since childhood, leaving secret messages for her friends to find, how she found these indecipherable texts like the most tantalizing puzzle, and how her mind broke them down bit by bit until the meanings were clear. Georgina commiserated, explaining how she had wanted to be a doctor at first, but had been so fascinated with dark psychology and the mystery of unknown diseases that she switched gears completely. Instead of a doctor, she became a researcher, desperate to discover things that would heal the broken, whether it be a mental or physical illness. They talked about the university, their lives growing up in two totally different countries, and how the Cold War had shaped them into the women they were today, trying to carve out places in a male-dominated world. They laughed, gently mocking their colleagues, especially the meathead Kirby, and all his American sensibilities. Georgina was slowly finding that Tatyana was a bright, whip-smart woman, deserving of her respect. With that realization came the sinking feeling in her stomach that she didn't want Tatyana to be here, in danger. And she certainly didn't want her going into space against some faceless unknown. She wasn't worried about herself. No amount of fear would be able to turn her away from the unanswered questions of this mission, or the budding responsibility she felt for the other astronauts. What if someone got hurt up there, and they died when she could have saved them? She wouldn't be able to live with herself. But still, she wished the translator could stay behind. Couldn't she read the texts and hear the chanting from mission control? She wanted to ask as much, but she knew what it was like to be in Tatyana's shoes, on the precipice of genuine success and respect, and it would be patronizing to recommend she stay behind. Georgina would have been furious had it been the other way around. So, she kept her mouth shut. She promised herself instead to keep an eye on the younger woman.
Georgina,
Tatyana whispered, now totally sloshed.
are you scared?
Petrified. Absolutely petrified.
Georgina whispered back.
But a little excited too.
Yeah,
Tatyana agreed.
it's like the turning point of my life.
They were sitting side by side, legs touching, and feet hanging over the side of the bed. Georgina looked into the alcohol-bright eyes of her colleague, taking in the gentle flush of her face and her pupils wide in the dark room. Right then, she realized she was beautiful.
Tatyana?
Hmm?
Can I kiss you?
Tatyana blinked at her, owlishly, before breaking into a soft smile.
I suppose.
They gingerly touched their lips together, and for a second, hesitation fell away. Tatyana's eyes fluttered open after a second.
Georgina?
Georgina!
Tatyana yelled through the headset.
Your harness isn't buckled!
Jolted back to reality, Georgina fumbled at the straps of her harness, desperately feeling for what she had missed. Finally, she felt the rogue buckle, clicking it into place just as Alexei initiated the final checks.
Metz, launch is a go. Ready. Affirmative.
Georgina swallowed hard. Her mouth felt like it was full of dust.
Affirmative.
She listened, her pulse pounding in her ears as he checked with everyone else, his voice cold and distant. It seemed like it was happening somewhere else, not here in this shuttle cabin, not in her reality. Once the last checks were concluded, all she could hear was the breathing of the other crew members in her headset, and that moment seemed to last forever, until Dr. Maxwell finally spoke up.
T-0. Launch is a go. Counting down 10.
Georgina's mind was racing. She thought about her sisters, her cat, and the dead astronauts on the moon.
9.
She didn't want to do this. She wanted to leave. Fuck them. Fuck all of them, her mind screamed.
8.
But she did want to go. She wanted to see the world from space. She wanted to be above it all. Georgina wanted to prove to everyone that had ever doubted her that she was someone.
7. 6. 5.
She looked over at Tatyana to see that she had screwed her eyes shut so hard that her whole face was pinched. She wished she could hold her hand.
4. 3. 2.
I love you, Mom. Dad, I'll be back soon. I hope you're proud. Please be proud.
1. Godspeed, crew. For all mankind. For all mankind.
Alexei repeated, and as the shuttle began to rise into the air, forcing Georgina back into her seat, she couldn't help but feel like there was something unholy in those words. She clenched her teeth and focused on staying conscious as the weight of the entire world pressed down on her. Mark wasn't sure what to think of the moon up close, which was an absolutely bizarre thought to have, but on brand as far as he was concerned. Even if he had been blown away in some rapturous awe inside, he would have kept his calm, cocky swagger on the outside because that's what everyone expected of him. The moon, though, just seemed to hang there, acres upon acres of barren land, gray, monotonous, boring. Earth had awed him, but it was because he could, with a single glance, view the entirety of humanity. When he had first been in orbit years ago, he had been on autopilot as he spoke to mission control, the whole of his heart and soul fixated on those little bundles of light dotting the globe. Births, deaths, love, sex, everything that encompassed life itself unfolding, invisible, beneath him. He wished he had gotten a better look after liftoff this time around. But time was of the essence. It was a tragedy that the first-timers on the ship hadn't been able to have that life-affirming glimpse of Earth. But he swore he would make it so they could look their fill on the return flight, as they rocketed home in triumph. He gave himself a few minutes to fantasize about the hero worship this crew would receive on their return. Minus public news crews, as Alexei has said, that they would want to not publicize this as much as possible. But it was almost immediately soured as he pictured the families embracing the other astronauts, mothers and fathers and children, while Kirby was tasked with shaking politicians' hands because there wasn't ever anyone to welcome him home.
When we get home, I'm going to find myself a good girl and settle down. No more empty houses. No more clammy handshakes after a job well done. I want a wife to leave lipstick prints on my cheek. And I want a son to brag to his classroom about his dad, the hero.
He snorted to himself, pretending not to notice the lump in his own throat.
You're a walking stereotype, man.
It was a personality that he had carefully crafted over the years. And as far as Mark knew, no one had seen past the facade. At this point in his life, there was no one who knew about the broken-down little boy that still lived inside of him, nursing a shiner from his dad's fist, and scribbling pictures of rockets among the stars. It was no wonder Mark Kirby had spent most of his life trying to escape the world. When he had been born, his fate was already written, being the only son of drunk Kenneth Kirby, and therefore the one to inherit the Kirby family farm when he grew up. People in town had told him stories about the Kirby farm, and how it had been the biggest, most profitable in the state at one time. But when it fell to his alcoholic father, the entire place had gone to shit. His poor, beautiful, kind, good-hearted mother had done everything she could to maintain what little crops and animals were left, while his dad spent days drinking himself stupid, night after night. But she was only one woman. His mother was a saint, and when he considered the good parts of his childhood, it was always her sweetly smiling face and the touch of her cool fingers on his cheek. He never wanted to be a farmer. In fact, he had detested the sprawling mass of untilled land that was to be his legacy. Mark's dad died when he was 15, and he and his mother had watched with dry eyes as they lowered his jaundiced yellow corpse into the earth. Once the last shovelful of dirt was thrown onto his grave, his mom had taken the deed to the farm and sold it to the highest bidder, severing Mark's legacy forever, and any ties she had to her bastard of an ex-husband. They had both wept with joy on the car ride out of town, glove box stuffed with cash, and a world of new opportunities opened to them. He only had 4 years after that with his mother, and although she died from debilitating cancer, she had gone in peace, telling Mark she would be watching him from heaven, and that she couldn't wait to see what he became. He joined the army the next day, and it was his first step towards the sky. Along the moon dominating his vision, Mark could also see the idiot head of Comrade Aleksei in the front, and indulged in a quick fantasy of slapping him upside that know-it-all skull. He couldn't help it. The distrust of the Ruskies was ingrained in his blood.
Hope you're proud, Ma. Even if I have to work alongside the Russians, I do it for everyone back home.
He refocused on the moon, and begrudgingly he had to admit it was spectacular in its own way. Barren, like he had thought before, but almost completely unexplored. Mark was still lost in thought when the comms crackled to life for the first time in what seemed like hours. It was Dr. Maxwell, and Mark leaned forward in his seat, wanting to hear everything that Alexei heard.
Initial orbit is now complete. Beginning landing sequence. Commander, do you copy? Copy.
Alexei confirmed. Alexei allows the autopilot to do its work, and for a lovely time, everything seems to be going as planned. There is casual chatter throughout the crew, pitched low as to not mess with anything Alexei might be doing. But Mark knows it's all hollow words to fill the time, while they all fight to not piss themselves. Even he was nervous. Nervous enough that it eclipsed the ravening excitement he felt about stepping onto the moon, and then piloting the mining rover. Peace, though, will always be broken. For the crew, it came as an ear-piercing screech of feedback over their helmet comms, more grating than anything he had ever heard. quickly replaced by the eerie whistling they had heard on the tapes. For the first time in his life, Mark Kirby's blood ran ice cold. Then, everything seemed to happen at once. Alexei was trying to break through the whistle tones to contact mission control, but there was no answer. The lights of the shuttle then burned impossibly bright, blowing more than a few bulbs in nearly weightless explosions of glass before the entire cabin went dark. Mark strained hard at his restraints, hands fumbling blindly at the buckles, planning to throw Alexei's ass away from the controls and land the shuttle manually. He had one belt undone when Alexei announces in a voice muffled by the helmet, since the comms were gone, exactly what he had been thinking.
I'm bringing us down manually. Hold on.
If Mark had been in his right mind, he still would have fought the Russian for the controls. But while he jerked uselessly at his restraints, he noticed Tatyana. Her body bowed in her seat, as if she was being electrocuted, and panicked sobs just barely audible through her helmet. Everyone was losing their cool in one way or another. A Rosetta Stone's worth of curses in different languages filling the cabin. But Tatyana's panic isn't controlled like theirs. It's blind, animalistic panic, and it catches something in Mark's chest. She was just a kid.
Hey!
He yelled over the furious din, having loosened himself enough to grab her stiffened hand.
It's all right, kid. Tatyana, stay with me, okay? We're gonna need you down there.
She turns her head enough to meet his eyes through the glass, fogged up from her open-mouthed breathing, and she lets enough tension out of her body to grab his wrist with her other hand, angling herself towards him like she was made of metal, and he was a lodestone.
Don't fucking leave me! Pojadę mi ojca tak umierać!
She gasps, before crying jaggedly in a string of Russian.
I'm not leaving you.
He promises, fully donning the identity of the stalwart American hero they all believed him to be. He raised his voice, declaring,
I'm not leaving any of you.
He didn't know if any of the other crew members gave a flying fuck about his declaration, but it didn't matter, because it grounded Tatyana. He held onto her hand while Alexei, his jaw clenched hard enough to shatter his teeth, maneuvered the out-of-control craft to the lunar surface.
C'est foutu!
Francois said, kicking the side of the downed shuttle as if it would do anything to help the present situation.
English, please, monsieur.
Kirby demanded, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. The CNES member whipped around to the American, feeling like every tendon in his neck was so taut they were about to snap.
It means it's fucked. You understand that? It's fucked, just like we are. Enough of that.
Alexei commands sharply. Out of the ship, the helmet comms had switched to battery power, and they were blessedly able to talk to one another clearly again. At that moment, though, Francois would have preferred to rip the entire helmet off. Death would be a fair price to not have to listen to this raving band of lunatics a moment longer.
It's not quite fair.
He thought.
The girls are nice and competent enough.
He paced along the length of the shuttle, trying desperately to keep his mind occupied before he fell into a pile of grief, fists pounding in the lunar dust, while he thought about his wife and child.
Abandon them. You abandoned them. You abandoned them.
The rest of the crew was cycling through all the expected reactions. Hysteria when Alexei confirmed that they were stranded. Soul-rending sorrow as they were forced to confront the idea of dying up here. And outrage that, to Francois' bitter delight, was focused completely on Alexei. He, on the other hand, was reliving over and over again when he crawled out of bed to answer the door that fateful night. The tired cries of his child were, in hindsight, as beautiful to him as the toll of bells, and his wife's hair spread across her white pillow, hand curled near her face, bathed in moonlight.
Moonlight. Ironic.
Far below in the crater, he could just make out the anomaly they had come for, and he turned away quickly. Seeing it, hearing it, made him feel ill. Instead, he looked back to the crew, only to see them converging on Aleksei. The Russian commander held his hands up in front of him, willing them to stop. But they all kept coming, demanding answers. Francois jogged over, reluctant to let violence break out when they were going to need each other, even if it meant saving Aleksei from the pummeling he deserved. He had almost reached the group when Alexei's shins hit the face of a rock, and he was stopped in his tracks. Cornered, panicked, the Russian yelled.
Fine! All of you! Selfish, shameful disgraces! So worried about your own lives! Do you want to know the real truth?
They hesitated, and Kirby, the apparent ringleader, gave Alexei one sharp nod.
We aren't here for a body recovery mission with a side of research into the anomaly, which we now know is called the Deliverer. We are here because the world, the entire world, depends on us. That thing.
He points down the crater to where the Deliverer rests.
It's so much more than you could imagine. It is a gateway.
A gateway to where?
Kirby asks.
Home. Earth for one.
The group gasps collectively, head jerking to the Deliverer.
But more importantly, to a new world.
Alexei talks for what seems like hours. Francois ends up lowering himself to the ground eventually, both exhausted and too shocked to bear his own weight anymore. The Russian describes how the Deliverer had saved one member of the first crew, Dr. Maxwell, by teleporting him home. It means that they might be able to return home too, but there was something even more pressing than that. Tatyana took over from there, her voice querulous at first, but building in confidence as she spoke.
It's some sort of cataclysmic event. Of what nature we aren't sure, but we believe the race that weaved up the creators left these deliverers in places where they believed some form of intelligent life could find them. They would be teleported to the creator's planet and therefore learn how to survive this cataclysm. We need the Deliverer back on Earth, so we can uncover the rest of its secrets and answer the Creator's invitation. That's how we...
Alexei cut her off at the last minute, even now needing to get the last word in himself.
That's how we save the world. We do this for all mankind. Do you understand?
Francois wasn't sure what Alexei had expected. Maybe some sort of hero worship for this scrap of hope. But instead, it's like a bomb went off. Everyone is yelling, besides poor Tatyana, who is cowering into Georgina's side. The crew demanded answers to question after question, but most pressing of all, why was this kept from them? He considers joining the fray but hesitates. Alexei was the only one with the entire truth, so he was the only one who could even possibly get them home. And if the entire crew tore each other limb from limb, they would just be another pound of flesh and bone paid to this Deliverer. He had been a good man, hadn't he? Why would he end up here, in this wasteland, so far from home if he had been a good man? Francois loved astronomy, loved the mysteries it presented and all the puzzles there within. But he slowly came to the realization that he didn't care for anything as he cared for his family. He would willingly perish up here if it kept them safe. Time was of the essence, and he needed to help get the crew under control if they had any chance of reaching the Deliverer. But he indulged himself with a few seconds of silence. Francois reminisced about meeting his wife for the first time, stumbling into the cafe at 6 a.m. after pulling an all-nighter researching a new form of exoplanet and seeing her beautiful face. She saved him then, with a double shot of espresso, and she continued to save him in so many different ways, with her love, with her grace, and with her steadfast belief in him as a man. His breathtaking wife, She had given him a daughter, so recently that he could still feel the weight of the baby's head in his open palm as he gazed upon his child. Even for a man like Francois, who knew more about the heavens than most common men, he still experienced the universe condensing down into that very second in time when he first held his daughter. His daughter and wife were everything to Francois. Heaven and earth, and all the stars in between. They gave him strength for what he had to do next.
Enough!
He bellowed.
So what if this prick deceived us? It's too late now to change it. And we heard the truth from Tatyana's mouth anyway. Did you not hear them? Did you not understand?
He stood tall then, demanding their attention, and they gave it to him.
We can die here, my friends. Sad skeletons in these suits that accomplish nothing. Maybe the world will end in this cataclysm. Maybe it won't. But either way, it would not matter to our dead bodies, no? Even if there's a kernel, a single atom of truth, what Alexei and Tatyana have told us, we have to chase it down. Whether for the eternity of Earth, or...
He paused, swallowing hard.
Or for the few that you love. Don't we owe it to them to try?
Everyone was silent, watching him as he caught his breath after his impassioned speech, and for a horrible second, he thought it had fallen on deaf ears, and he had failed his family. But then...
Well, what are you guys waiting on? Let's detach this damn rover and get the job done.
The rover moves over the surface of the moon at a crawl, treads churning the dirt and dust as the crew descended into the crater. After the Frenchman's impressive speech, everyone had finally fallen into their assigned roles, working like the colony ants Alexei had always viewed them as. He labored alongside them, hearing their voices in his comms, and the threads of hope and fear that saturated their every word. But fear as they did, they still did what they had to do, swallowing the enormity of what Alexei had revealed and continuing to move forward. Maybe it was love like he knew it was for Francois, or maybe it was glory like he was sure drove Kirby. But regardless, the crew persisted, and for Alexei, that was all he could ask for. For the first time, he felt camaraderie with them all. They were dependent on each other, teetering on the verge of death, and that truth was like a wire binding them all together. He even coughed a laugh at something Georgina Metz grumbled, and an unwelcome idea bloomed in his mind. What if these people weren't just worker ants, perfectly suited bodies to complete a job? Alexei had spent so much of his time in his office, poring over the translation and footage, listening to the chants, until they became part of his stream of consciousness, so much so that he hadn't realized this motley crew might be worth more than he had presumed. Could he have been wrong about them? Should he have told them the entire truth up front so they knew what they faced? He had been so sure they would panic and flee that he had been determined to keep the secret. But watching them swallow this impossibility of truth here on the moon and still press forward made him doubt. It would have been so much easier to have had their expertise in full from the very beginning, not just when he was able to access it with a lie. And if he was wrong about the crew, could he be wrong about the deliverer too? The thought sent a chill racing down all of his nerves like ice water. He always knew there was an off chance he was racing to his doom when he sought the deliverer, but it had been worth it just for the chance to know. The idea that he could die, ignorant of the brilliant truth he had sought, had been a constant. Alexei sat in the passenger seat of the rover, Georgina at the wheel, and Kirby mounted up next to the drill. Kirby had taken the lead, as was to be expected for the big-mouthed American, but at least it gave Alexei time to ponder. One would think the chances of everything being right, the Cataclysm, the Deliverer being a gateway, and the Creators saving them, were astronomically low. But still, Alexei knew in his very bones he was right. When he closed his eyes, the chanting played in his head like a mantra, over and over. He wouldn't have been drawn all this way for nothing, like some inevitable force of nature had been driving him forward all these thousands of miles, if he was wrong.
Hurry, hurry, hurry.
Something begged.
We are waiting.
Alexei clenched his fists and locked his gaze onto the cavern, dark and bewitching, and the Deliverer within.
I'm coming!
Fear was cold, and Mark realized that every instance of it that he had felt before paled in comparison to what he felt then. It covered the back of his neck in wet, chilled sweat, making him shiver in his spacesuit, which usually felt like a sauna to him. It tingled at the tips of his fingers and made the corners of his mouth feel numb. And then, there was that damned chanting in his head, muted behind his own thoughts, but constant. The beat of a drum, an otherworldly heartbeat. He flexed his hands on the control levers of the drill, trying to keep the feeling in his fingers, and to burn off some of the nervous energy inside of him. Georgina had stopped the rover right outside the gaping mouth of the cave, and it was clear that no one really knew what to do from that point forward. Inside the darkened cavern, lit from the headlights of the rover, the object of their mission hovered in the air, oddly plain for something so ominous. Mark didn't know what it was about the thing, the Deliverer, as Alexei had called it, but it messed with the primordial part of his brain, the same part that would be terrified of the triangle-shaped head of a viper, or shivered at the jerky movements of spiders' legs. It just screamed wrong and danger, even if it was just a simple sphere. The other thing, though, the two long-dead cosmonauts on the ground outside the cave, well, Mark figured that it was perfectly natural to be afraid of that.
Their names were Victor and Pavel.
Alexei had told them before they descended into the crater.
We are still missing Natalia, though.
Why are they lined up like that?
Georgina had asked, lowering the binoculars from her helmet.
Surely they didn't die standing right next to each other.
I don't have any information on that.
Alexei had replied, seeming unbothered by the almost ritualistic placement of what remained of the first mission's crew.
I already told you that this isn't a body recovery mission anyway. Don't worry about it.
Easier said than done, he thought, while tearing his eyes away from the two still forms, their once bright orange spacesuits dulled by years of moon dust. Long minutes passed, the discomfort of the rest of the crew apparent in the way they shifted in their seats, shook their heads, and rolled their necks and shoulders. Undoubtedly, they were hearing the same thing that Mark was, but no one mentioned it. The only crew member who didn't look like they were about to crawl out of their skin was Alexei, who simply sat with his back ramrod straight and his gaze fixed on the Deliverer.
So,
Mark finally said, his voice across the helmet comms making everyone jump.
what exactly are we doing now?
Tatyana, sounding both exhausted and on edge, replies,
Dr. Maxwell doesn't recall exactly how he was teleported home, but all we know for sure is that he wasn't directly touching the Deliverer, and Natalia Ivanova was. He made it home, and she did not. Although he does describe her last few actions as being out of character, and possibly driven by some sort of psychosis.
But we aren't trying to go home.
Alexei sneers.
We are trying to prevent the cataclysm. Remember? The end of the world?
No one is debating that.
Georgina snaps from the driver's seat, turning around to look at him.
I know you think we're a bunch of empty-headed cowards, but we know what we have to do. It just might have been nice to have known what we were getting ourselves into before boarding a fucking ship and flying out here.
Fine.
The Russian man huffs.
We don't have much to go off of, but Maxwell made it back to Earth alive. And he wasn't touching the Deliverer, but was in his right mind and in close proximity. Victor and Pavel were either deceased on landing or, in Pavel's case, unknown. But not in close proximity to the sphere when Natalia made a connection with it. Had it just killed her, she would be one of the other bodies, I would imagine. Dr. Maxwell described her as being under the influence of the Deliverer, or possibly dealing with some sort of psychosis. But if any of the lost crew actually made contact with the creators, it was her. So, we need to replicate what she did as best as we possibly can.
Everyone looked to Francois then, as he had been the voice of reason earlier, but the Frenchman seems weighed down by something.
It's grief.
Mark thinks.
He's the only one with a family, after all. Poor guy.
But with no one else speaking up, and still having no idea what the next move was supposed to be, Mark speaks up once more.
Okay, so we touch it. That's our master plan?
He didn't feel right. Nothing was sitting right inside Mark, and the fear that was still coursing through him was so uncomfortably unfamiliar that he felt like he could run a marathon just to escape it if the possibility presented itself. He knew how everyone saw him. Loud, brash, over the top. And Mark accepted that stereotype. Well, at least when it suited him, which was most of the time. But when he tried to fall back on it then, it simply felt like the fall was never ending. It was just fear all the way down. It was probably a stupid move, but often bravery and stupidity wore the same face, especially when they were coming from Mark Kirby. So, full of stupid bravery, he hopped down from the rover, letting go of the drill and waiting for the slow jump to deposit him on the ground before declaring,
"And let's get on with it. I'll go first."
Alexei moved faster than he had the entire mission, undoing his seatbelt and pushing off the edge of the rover to intercept Mark before he could even take a few steps. Mark didn't plan on stopping, but when he saw the fanatic panic on Alexei's face, it brought him up short.
No!
The Russian barked.
I said we need to replicate everything that Natalia did, as accurately as possible. And that certainly doesn't mean that your filthy hands are going to be the first ones to touch the Deliverer.
Baffled, Mark held his gloved hands in front of his face, turning them left and right, before shrugging.
We're wearing the same gloves, comrade. So I'm no filthier than you.
It took the other man a minute to collect himself and return to his cool composure from before. But he managed.
What I meant was that the person with the closest connection to the Deliverer needs to be the one to make contact with it first. Natalia was under its influence, and while none of us are that far gone, we still need to make our choice carefully.
Francois, who had been silent the entire time still, sighed.
Then, let us be truthful to one another. We all heard the whistling aboard the ship. And now, we all hear the chanting, yes? Either that is the case, or I'm going slowly insane. Which would be welcome in this situation, if I'm being honest.
I hear it.
Tatyana said, her voice small, prompting Georgina to admit the same.
Me too.
Yeah,
Mark sighed.
it's definitely there. I thought it might be my blood pressure at first, but if y'all are hearing the same thing, then
He shrugged.
we're all equally as crazy, I guess.
Of course you would consider it a defect.
Alexei laughed, and Mark senses a heavy thread of superiority in it.
Regardless, I've been connected to the Deliverer before we even left Earth. It's why I knew I had to be the lead on the mission, so it needs to be me that makes the first connection.
Tension rose among the group in an instant, and Mark briefly contemplated pushing past the other man to access the deliverer first, no matter how insistent he was. But the truth was that Mark didn't want to touch the damned thing. If he was a betting man, he'd say that no one except for Aleksei actually did.
And what do we do if you disappear?
Francois sighed.
That's the plan.
He bit out in response.
Natalia obviously wasn't in her right mind. I will be, and I will be able to communicate to the creators that we are here to discover how to avoid the cataclysm event on Earth. Then I will be able to return with instructions on how to get home. Or, if I don't, you'll all have to interact with the deliverer yourself.
Our oxygen won't last forever.
Georgina pointed out, but Aleksei has an answer for that too.
Give me 1 hour, and then if nothing happens, you can follow. I recommend teams of 2, but if you all want to come at once, I'm not going to try and dissuade you.
Arschloch.
Georgina muttered.
I suppose we don't have any other choice, eh? Get on with it then, oh fearless leader.
Everyone murmurs their agreement. Aleksei had Mark by the arms still, and when Georgina spoke, his eyes snapped to Mark's. Not once had Aleksei looked anything but smug in Mark's opinion, but right then, he saw an echo of the same fear that he was feeling in the Russian. He could easily understand why, too. If Aleksei was telling the truth, and he'd been called to the moon by the deliverer before he even left the atmosphere, then that moment must be one that he had thought of 1,000 times before. It was the moment he needed to finally prove that he was more important than anyone else there. A chosen one, and not just some mere crew member. To Mark, though, it looked like Aleksei hadn't considered how hard it would be to actually meet his own expectations. His path had 2 outcomes, death or glory, and he was sure it was the former taking the wind out of the other man's sails. He was looking at Mark, the closest person to him, for any ounce of human connection, maybe some sort of understanding, or maybe for one wild moment, he thought that Mark might volunteer to go with him. And Mark, despite the uncrossable trench of differences between the two of them, considered it. But then, he took one look at Francois, tight-lipped and stone-faced, and simply patted Aleksei on the shoulder instead.
Good luck, comrade,
he told him with a lopsided smile and a wink. Aleksei paled, but managed to make sure his last expression to Mark was filled with all the malice he still held inside. Mark walked back to the rover as Aleksei moved forward in that awkward, bouncing moon gait. His head was held high, and his shoulders squared, but each step looked like it took a Herculean effort to make. Like Aleksei knew, instinctually, that he should lock his legs and refuse to move. But something else in his head, whether it be arrogance or compulsion from the deliverer, drove him forward. They could all hear him breathing through the comm system, his breath shaky and unsure, but no one commented on it. Once Aleksei was halfway to the deliverer, which was only about 20 feet away, Mark felt a sting of regret for making the poor fool go alone, but it was too late. The heavy breathing became wheezing as he made his final few feet of approach. It sounded like the Russian was sucking in air through a straw, unable to ever get the full amount that his lungs were screaming for. No one could look away, as Aleksei's hands hovered over the orb like a fortune teller, and they all heard as the chanting in the back of their minds grew louder. Those few seconds felt like they lasted hours, before Tatyana blurted out,
Alexei! Wait!
But he was speaking too, at the exact same moment.
For all mankind,
Alexei whispered, placed his gloved hands on the deliverer, and popped out of existence as if he had never been there to begin with. And then, the cave began to crumble. The rover was thankfully outside the cavern still, but the energy put off by Alexei disappearing, combined with the crumbling roof and walls, still scared the hell out of everyone. They had no time to process Alexei being there in 1 nanosecond, and gone the next. All of their attention locked onto the rocks coming down in a slow cascade, dust blooming from the ground as they struck. The deliverer was gone from their sight, but all of them knew it was still there, with the chanting still pulsing in the back of their minds. The cave-in was short-lived, but the detritus thrown up from it lingered in the air, obscuring their vision. It looked unreal, the world painted in all shades of gray and nothing else, and it made Mark's mind take a little too long to compute what he was seeing. Then, like a switch being flipped, all hell broke loose.
He's gone!
Tatyana cried out.
Fuck this.
Georgina cursed, pressing buttons on the console of the rover until the engine flared to life.
Let's get back to the ship. We can't stay here. But he said he'd be back!
Tatyana was bordering on hysterical.
If he comes back and everything is caved in, won't it kill him?
The dust will clog our air filters in less than 20 minutes, and we don't even know if he's alive at this point or where he is. We should just go back to the ship and see if we can get any lines of communication.
Francois was interrupted when Mark climbed onto the back of the rover and slapped his hand down on the drill hard enough that it shook the vehicle.
Are you all forgetting that we came prepared for this outcome? We're already on the damned moon. Why the hell wouldn't we use all the tools given to us?
Did you not just hear what I said about the dust killing our filters?
Francois growled, but Mark was unmoved.
We need to clear the way, and once we're through, I say we just go ahead and touch the stupid thing and get this show on the road. We know Maxwell made it home, so which outcome has the better odds? Fix the broken ship, which I'm telling you right now is going to be nearly impossible, or use the deliverer. Even if it takes us somewhere else besides home, at least it won't be the moon.
Francois turned his head and looked behind the group at the shuttle off in the distance, and closed his eyes slowly, taking deep breaths to center himself.
We'll take a vote.
The girls would be the tiebreaker, but neither of them looked all too anxious to cast their lot. To Mark's surprise, though, it was Tatyana, tears running down her face behind the glass bubble of her mask that made the call.
I just want to get it over with. Whatever may come, let's drill.
Mark would be lying if he had to pretend that he was any sort of reluctant to power the drill up, and it took all his self-control and constant reminder that the situation was dire, not to whoop out loud as the engine spun up. Georgina drove the rover forward and turned it around, the drill pointing backwards out of it, and slowly backed the vehicle up until the tip of the wildly spinning machine hit home. Tatyana and Francois had gotten out and were standing a ways away, trying to preserve as much time on their filters as possible, since they didn't need to be present for this part of the whole ordeal.
Holy shit, I love this thing.
Mark thought as he suppressed a laugh. The drill simply ate the moonstone, obliterating it with a single touch, and to the American it was fun as hell. He didn't rein himself in, not a bit, considering that running the drill might be the last bit of enjoyment he ever had in his life. Mark relished it. He pretended he didn't hear the scraping and rumbling from above, signifying that the structural integrity of the cavern was shot to hell. What did it matter at this point anyway? Mark knew they were getting close. The roar of the drill drowned out slowly by the chanting in the back of his mind. But what he didn't expect was how the deliverer reacted when they got too close for comfort. Georgina kept moving the rover back in small increments, but when she went to do it again, it was like the drill hit some sort of force field, and it pushed them back with enough force that Mark struggled to stay in his seat. The drill whined in the open air, pointing straight up and spinning freely, before he managed to hit the kill switch, and the quiet pressed on his eardrums once more.
Did we hit it?
Georgina asked, shaken.
No, we hit near it.
Mark replied. He thought he might have whiplash, but it wasn't like he could rub his neck through the suit, so he just shook off the buzzing in his ears instead.
It has something like a shield around it.
Lunar dust still made it difficult to see beyond a few feet in front of him, and the lack of any sort of wind combined with the lesser gravity made the gray, heavy clouds just hang in the air, like an impenetrable fog. Mark waved his hands in front of him, fanning it away as much as he could, and thankfully it worked well enough for him to see that they had succeeded in their mission thus far. What he physically moved with his hands moved sluggishly through the air and slid around an invisible bubble of force field, revealing the Deliverer, untouched within. It was the closest Mark had been, and while he had written off Aleksei's obsession with the thing as some sort of mental deficiency, things were different now that he was close. Very, very different. He wasn't sure if it was the proximity, being able to visually see it up close, or a combination of both, but the chanting in Mark's head that he had begun to think of as more of an annoying headache than anything else changed. The unintelligible words still came in heavy, steady metronome, but now he understood the message that was being conveyed to him, and he alone, in a place deep in his soul. The whistling from when they were out in orbit returned as a sweet harmony, and the two separate songs twisted around each other like birds in flight. And although Mark couldn't pick out a single word, he knew they were promising him everything he had ever desired in life. First, a way home, unharmed and with all of his crew. A hero's welcome, cheering in celebration, and a short, blonde NASA administrator welcoming him back to the United States, with a smile on her bright red lips. The voice told him how he would marry that girl, and they would have a daughter he would name after his mother, and somewhere in it all they would give him the solution to prevent the cataclysmic event in 2000. That idea was nebulous. He couldn't quite wrap his mind around what the solution would be, and that's what snapped Mark out of it all with a jolt. He jerked in his seat, like he would during those warm, floaty moments before sleep, before dreaming he missed a step.
Kirby?
Georgina's voice cracked through his helmet.
Mark, you okay, buddy?
He licked his dry lips before answering.
Yeah, this thing. It about got me, I think. It's so damn loud.
I guess we should get moving then.
Georgina sighed, her rough exterior falling away long enough that he could hear the apprehension in her tone.
You think it's been an hour?
I think I don't care how long it's been. I'm ready to get the hell out of here.
He could see the Earth, small and round and blue, behind him. But in front, it was just the Deliverer, hovering there in the barely person-sized pathway made by the drill, waiting for all of them, and singing into his skull so loudly that it made his eyes water.
In pairs or all together?
Francois asked. They could all hear the dull beeping of the filter warning on the air systems. They had about an hour left, so Mark would have thought everyone would be in a hurry to be transported back home, hopefully. But now that the time had come, it felt almost impossible to move forward. Mark Kirby had never regretted his choice in career, but surrounded by the gray, desolate, lifeless terrain of the moon, the remorse of that choice stung at him. People weren't supposed to be in places like that, let alone die there. He glanced over at the still, lined-up bodies of the two original crew members and swallowed down a swell of nausea.
Together,
he said with a sense of finality.
Whatever happens, I don't want any of us left alone here.
It's been over an hour.
Tatyana breathed.
Alexei isn't coming back.
Fuck Alexei. This isn't about him anymore. It's about all of them, back there.
He waved his arms towards Earth, barely bigger than a softball, but somehow containing everything. Love, loss, ambition, and hope. Life as he and everyone else standing there with him knew it. The young Russian woman nodded tightly. She was the only one that Mark had worried might balk. But at that moment, everyone was on board, and their bravery held. It was time. He led the way. It was a short walk from the mouth of the cavern, past the rover that they had left parked inside. Mark hadn't been sure how long the cave would hold, and he figured if it went down again, the space the rover offered would at least give them some space and air, as well as the path to the Deliverer. Not a man for poetics, he was surprised by how poignant those last few moments on the moon were. The tight gathering of his crew, the howling and chanting in his head pounding against his skull like an animal trying to escape a cage. And behind him, the fragile, beautiful, cruel and merciful world that had raised him. Mark Kirby hoped that, if he died that day, someone would eventually bring him home and bury him in the dark, living soil of the earth. He tried not to think of the bodies they were still leaving behind, Pavel and Victor. He wouldn't forget their names. The force field bubble that kept the Deliverer safe from the cave admitted them with no problem. Then it was time. Cracks, dark and nearly unnoticeable on the surface of the sphere, began to glow, as if it sensed their intentions. There was a scrambling sound behind him, stone on stone, muted through the helmet. It was a small sound, not the bone-deep rumble of an imminent collapse, but it was still movement.
We're out of time,
Mark said shakily.
Once we're on the other side, whether it's home or not, we stick together. No matter what. Do you hear me?
Oui.
Da. Yeah.
Mark nodded once.
Okay. On three then.
They all hovered their hands above the Deliverer. He swore he could feel heat radiating off of it.
1, 2, 3.
He didn't reach the count of 3, but 3 things did happen at once. First, the scrambling sound he had heard minutes before occurred again, but this time right behind him, frantic and spastic. Second, a hand grabbed his shoulder with an impossibly strong grip, and when he whipped his head around to see who it was, all he could see was the dull orange of an old cosmonaut suit, before it jerked him backwards, hard. And third, Tatyana screamed his name.
Mark!
Grabbing 4 and actually catching his gloved hand before whatever was pulling him away could go too far. It all happened too fast for his mind to catch up. But as soon as it did, his entire existence was that cold, nauseating fear.
Fuck!
Francois spat, grabbing Georgina's suit and tugging it to make her look at him.
Do it!
She needed no clarification, simply taking Tatyana's free hand in hers and slamming it down to the Deliverer along with her own, while Francois did the same on the other side. Tatyana was screaming for him, even as they popped out of existence, and she never let go of his hand either. He was only able to get one sob of horror as the freezing cold hit his bare wrist, while the thing that had attacked him wrapped its arms around his neck, and a second set of hands slapped into the sides of his helmet and began to roughly work it off his head with impossible strength. Mark was already dead. He knew that much, but he still tried, with what was left of his strength, to turn his body to look outside of the cave at the end.
Let me see home!
He howled, and the seal on his helmet began to crackle.
Let me see home!
He still knew who he was, what he was, but there was no rhyme or reason to it. The girls were there, just as formless as he was, and then they weren't, and he was alone in that place that wasn't a place, the frigid, empty space that was between. Being an innumerable amount of atoms, Or maybe just the memory of those atoms. Francois found it difficult to form a thought. But he managed. Did he mess up by not holding onto Georgina when they touched the deliverer? Is that why they were gone, and he was still there, shattered? The linear thoughts were hard, but the pressure of regret and grief were not. He had one chance to get home to his wife and child, but he had ruined it. He couldn't picture their faces, beautiful Elizabeth and sweet Marie, but he knew them. In the depths of every cell, every piece of him that ever was, he knew them. They were his, and he had doomed them. Then, the voice spoke, except it was familiar.
Hey, buddy,
Mark Kirby said.
I don't have very long, so listen closely, okay?
I can't answer you.
He thought, bewildered.
I have no mouth.
Mark was somehow visible to him as a whole being, as cocky and smug as ever, his arms crossed and his hair slicked back from his face.
I'm not going to be able to go with you guys. I wish I was. God, do I wish I was. But I've been given another purpose. Another way to be a hero, you know?
We can't do this without you.
Yes, you can. And you will. I know this is a lot for me to ask you to process, but I'm only here with you because someone is using me to speak to you. He calls himself Samyaza. I can't stress this enough. What I'm about to tell you is the most important bit of information that you might ever hear, so pay attention. When we're done talking, you'll be transported to the same place as Tatyana and Georgina. But they won't have experienced this interaction with me like you are. If this is going to work, then you can't tell them anything that goes on between the two of us. Do you understand? Your secrecy will be the difference between success and failure.
Yes, I understand.
Good. This will be a lot of information for you, Francois. But the entity that is using me to reach you believes that you are intelligent enough to understand.
Francois can't exactly see Mark, but he can sense the smirk in his voice.
I guess if I had to pick anyone in the group, it would be you too. But anyway, I'm an avatar for one of the creators, the one calling themselves Samyaza. They are the one that broke from the main population and is claiming that they want to help us, not mislead us. You see, the creators were indeed responsible for the deliverers we found. But Alexei was wrong. There isn't some convoluted plan to save us, but end us instead. The only cataclysmic event is their arrival. They aren't planning on saving us from anything. They are the only real danger. The creator that possesses me and a few others of his kind are part of a rogue faction that have split off to prevent annihilation of the human race and similar acts of destruction in other places throughout the universe. Samyaza and his rogue faction tried to overwrite the original message, which was just a ploy to bring humans to the creators like lambs to the slaughter, but the overwrite was never completed. The rogue faction meant to warn us and other races on different worlds to avoid the deliverers at all costs. The main population of the creators, though, was trying to keep us complacent and eventually bring all of us to them. Are you still with me, Francois?
Was he? Francois wasn't sure, but he could process what Kirby was saying and retained it somewhere in the vapor of his being. So far, he thought he understood. The life form using Mark to speak was good, even if they seemingly kidnapped Mark and took his body. And the ones that actually built and left the deliverers were bad. Simple. Concepts a child could comprehend.
I'm still with you.
Good. Now, when you join Tatyana and Georgina, you won't be back on Earth. You will be on the Creator's home planet. The name would be incomprehensible for you, but...
Mark paused again, as if thinking before continuing.
Samyaza seems to think that the name Archaron would be fitting, considering human symbology or whatever.
He laughs, but there is no joy in it.
Francois, I'm going to give you a gift. and you will carry it in your left hand. With this gift, you will be able to sever the Creator's connection with Earth permanently. But the cost will be your life. Like the cost to relay this information to you and deliver this weapon was mine.
Francois felt alarm, but in a vague way, like it was bouncing between the parts of him floating in the ether.
I can't die. I have a family.
That's why he chose you, out of all of us. You love your wife and child, and you would die for them if it meant they would survive. And that is exactly what Samyaza is asking you to do. Of the four of us, you are the one that will act without hesitation or fear, because you know that it will ascertain that Elizabeth and Marie will live a long and content life, right?
It wasn't fair. He didn't even get to tell them goodbye, but Kirby was right. He'd been willing to die for them on the moon, and he'd be willing to die for them on some distant world, too.
Damn you. Yes.
I knew you'd agree. You're saving the whole fucking world, Francois. Do you know that? You're going to be a hero. The most important man to ever have been born.
What good does that do for me when I'm dead? All of that is just cold comfort. And how are you so calm with all of this? You are fine being a puppet? Beggars' corpses that were used to murder you in cold blood? For this raw creature?
It's not as if this was my chosen path either,
he said bitterly.
But from what they tell me, this was the best and only way to relay the proper information to one of us, as he needed to speak through a vessel, a living one. But after losing my hand and having this entity within me, I will die when they release control. I want to go home too, just like you. But we have to play our parts. What choice do we have? Listen, we don't have much longer. You will only have one chance. Send the girls through the deliverer that they will have prepared to send one of you to Earth if you cooperate. And once they are gone, you will destroy everything. Samyaza has used a significant amount of his life force to embed a weapon of unfathomable power within your grasp. When you activate it, it will create a wormhole for a single second that will destroy everything around it. That includes yourself. But it will guarantee that they lose their deliverer that is connected to Earth, and therefore the coordinates forever. Your blood, and only yours, will be the activation key.
Fine, okay. But what about you, Mark? How are any of us supposed to swallow the idea of you being some unavoidable collateral damage? You were supposed to lead us. I don't want to leave you, my friend.
I don't want to go either.
Francois had never heard fear in the American's voice, and it shook him.
When I talk to you, I'm still me. But before you were here, and once you leave, I'm just nothing. It's cold, and I feel afraid. I don't want to forget who I am. I want to feel the sun on my face. God, Francois, please help.
Mark's voice cut off, just as hysteria began to leak into it, and it left him feeling desolate, helpless. Then Mark spoke again, but his voice was flat and emotionless. It echoed, but came slowly, like Kirby suddenly was speaking in a foreign tongue.
Enough. Mark Kirby has served his purpose, and by doing so gained honor. I am Samyaza, and we are out of time, Francois Leblanc. I will leave you with this last explanation before you awaken.
No, I need to speak with him again. I need to tell him goodbye.
He knows, and that will have to be enough for you. Now, cease speaking and listen. These seconds grow short, and I must send you through the Deliverer's teleportation stream before it closes. So I will keep this brief. The rogue faction was my own creation. but the entirety of my life's work will be pointless if I allow my people to destroy life on Earth. It was us that seeded your planet with life long ago, when we were an altruistic and young race. Now, a genetic disease is decimating our people. A child has not been born to us for centuries, and our only hope is repairing our genetic code with pieces from another race on one of the planets that we seeded long ago. The people of Earth are a close enough match, but the harvesting will not be peaceful, and that is why it must be stopped. It's why you are the key, Francois. An opportunity like this one has never been presented before, and may never be again. Once, no other race had technology or means to rival ours, but it is estimated that in a short amount of time, the year 2000 for you, our race will be extinct. That is why the Deliverer translation mentioned that year. Moreover, in our search for a genetic match, my race has enslaved and decimated hundreds of other civilizations. We are not what we once were. And if you manage to destroy the Deliverer that is connected to the network that spans the galaxy, we do not have the means to find it and rebuild that connection again. Your home and your family will be safe. That is the gift I can give you in return for your life. Do you think you can do this, Francois?
He wished he could picture their faces, Marie and Elizabeth, but in the form he existed in, it was impossible. But he knew they were everything, and that knowledge was enough.
Yes, tell me what to do.
It tore her apart at the seams, touching the Deliverer and being catapulted into nothingness. It was just between one breath and the next, but being torn down to her most basic elements would be something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She held onto Tatyana like a lifeline, and even when they both disintegrated for that short, eternal moment, she swore that they stayed connected. Then, the Deliverer spat them both out onto the stone ground, and she was a woman again, not a billion parts of a single whole. She landed on her hands and knees next to Tatyana, who went sprawling on her stomach. Her own stomach rolled, and she retched, back arching like a cat as she struggled not to vomit in her helmet. Her body was racked with pain and distortion, and she could only guess that it was the same for Tatyana, if the noises she made were anything to go off of. It was only seconds before a split, blacker and more infinite than she could have ever thought possible, opened in the air to her left, and Francois came stumbling out of it, his hands fisted, shaking so hard that she was sure his bones would snap from the stress. That was 3 of them. So where was Mark? What she saw before touching the Deliverer should have been impossible, but so was teleportation, so she wasn't going to count anything out. What she thought she witnessed was so terrible that she retched again, swallowing the bile down as hot tears pricked the corners of her eyes. It had been the 2 dead cosmonauts from the first mission, pulling Mark away from them. Georgina had gotten frostbite once as a child on her big toe, and the faces that she saw in those dusty, decades-old masks had been the same color as her frozen toe, a sickening combination of red, black, and blue. Suddenly, she heard a sound behind her, a soft rustling that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The sky overhead was a sickly shade of bruised purple, casting an eerie glow over the entire area. and Georgina's mind was reeling as she tried to make sense of it all. She felt as though she had stepped into some kind of twisted nightmare, and she had no idea how to get out.
It was supposed to take us home,
she thought, feeling all at once like a little girl, all over again.
I just want to go home.
She forced herself to her feet, the motions even more difficult in the clunky spacesuit. But once she gained her balance, Georgina took a few shaky steps to spin in a circle and looked around. For a moment, she stood frozen, trying to take in everything at once. The ground beneath her feet was made of polished, iridescent stone, the color scheme nonsensical and spiraling. The buildings around her were a mix of sleek, metallic structures and ornate, towering spires, hostile and strangely sized, and it all was sheltered by a thick, curling fog. There was more movement, figures walking towards the three of them from a long distance away, but her vision was still adjusting, and Georgina didn't have time to focus before she heard Tatyana screaming. The poor woman's voice was hoarse from it, having been yelling before the jump too, but it still made Georgina's heart lurch to hear it. Closing her eyes to ward off the spinning feeling still plaguing her, she knelt by the other woman, but Tatyana was scrambling away from something small and pale on the ground next to her.
Merde!
She heard Francois bite out, and then she heard him retching too. Against her better judgment, she tried to look closer at the thing that had the rest of the crew debilitated, and what she saw disturbed her so much that it didn't click at first. There, curled up on a single, jaundiced yellow tile like a dead spider, was Mark Kirby's severed hand.
Mark!
Tatyana sobbed.
Oh God, I did this! I killed him!
Francois made a noise of denial.
It's only his hand. We don't even know.
He's dead.
A voice as dry as kindling before the flames interrupted from the mist.
It was unfortunate, but we deemed him a risk.
Georgina pulled Tatyana to her feet, and they both strained to see who was speaking. The shape of them was familiar, human and bulky from a suit similar to theirs, but without the telltale bubble head of their helmets. And it was a faded, tattered orange. She didn't recognize the woman who walked out of the mist, but the spacesuit she wore hung on her emaciated body like her shoulders were simply a hanger for it. The stranger moved like a marionette on strings, and her head hung to the side as if it was too heavy to hold up properly. At first, Georgina just thought she was elderly. The closer the woman came, the more apparent it became that it wasn't age that lined her face. Instead, she seemed dried out, dehydrated, and shadows hung in the hollows of her eyes.
Who?
Tatyana asked, and Francois answered.
Natalia Ivanova, pilot of the first moon mission.
His voice was matter-of-fact, as if what he was saying wasn't absolutely ludicrous.
Yes.
The stranger, Natalia, confirmed, in her crackling, glass-shard voice.
This corporeal form belongs to Natalia Ivanova, and she has served us well as a tool to communicate with your companion, Alexei, and now the three of you as well.
She extended her arm with obvious effort.
If you'd like to follow, I can lead you to Alexei, and we can clear up some of the confusion you must be feeling. Come, now.
Georgina felt Tatyana gripping her arm, and saw Francois moving close enough that he was nearly touching the two of them. There was no comfort or safety in numbers, but it was still human instinct to gather together.
What choice do we have?
Francois said tightly. So they went, a shaken trio following a long-dead cosmonaut through a hazy, alien city. It didn't make sense for it to be so empty, but the place didn't feel quite real, as if it existed between two places at once. Or maybe it had been thriving at one point in time, and just stood as a relic to what had once been by the time the three of them had arrived. They walked for 5 or so minutes, adjusting to the change in gravity from the moon as they went, until they were walking upright once more, and not weighed down by the heaviness of their own existence. All of them tried to speak to Natalia, or what was left of her, but she didn't respond to them in any way that made sense.
"You're very important,"
she would rasp.
"You will be the first of millions."
The fog began to lift as they approached what appeared to be some sort of open-air theater or small coliseum, a half-moon of 6 huge, ornate metal seats in the very front, where the spectators observed their approach. Those spectators made her stumble backwards a step. They were tall and lithe, at least 8 feet tall, and as far as she could tell, humanoid in structure. They made the primordial part of her shiver, but it wasn't like there was anywhere to run. Painted in muted jewel tones, Georgina was startled to see that they were covered in feathers instead of flesh. So small and tightly packed that she hadn't even noticed at first. 4 faceted eyes, 2 parallel sets, blinked above a slit of a mouth, and in between, there were only 2 suggestions of nostrils. Their skulls were elongated, some more than others, but they were shaped similarly enough to herself that Georgina's terror still held a thread of curiosity. They were familiar to her, but not familiar to her mind. Familiar to her very cells. A new deliverer, this one already glowing with those golden cracks, floated in the air in the center of it all. But she didn't hear the same all-encompassing chanting coming from it that she did the one from the moon. They had gotten her where they wanted her, so there was no reason for that siren call anymore, she supposed. In front of them, kneeling on the ground in supplication, was Alexei. His head was bare, helmet discarded, and he whipped around to look at them all once he heard their steps on the stone tile. She wished she could say that she was happy to see Alexei, relieved that he was alive, but there was a look of fanaticism on his face that gave her pause. He was shady and unreliable on the best of days, but the look of devotion he wore let her know that he would betray them in a second for the creatures seated in front of him.
I told you to wait!
Alexei hissed.
It had been quite long enough.
Francois bit back, gaze flickering from the silent observers to Alexei, and then back again.
We lost Mark, and you've been there doing what? Kissing us?
An unfortunate loss,
the wraith of Natalia said. Alexei gapes at Natalia.
She hasn't spoken a single word yet.
He marvels.
None of them have. Until now.
When Natalia speaks, she doesn't look at any of them specifically, but seems to just address the near-empty square as a whole.
There was no reason for us to waste energy manifesting a physical voice and presence with this body until you all were here together,
she explains.
Us? We?
Tatyana finally speaks up, the puzzle of what was happening bringing her out of her fear in small increments. Georgina could tell she had a hard time looking at Natalia, but at least the nearly human woman was better than the silent strangers that watched them, unmoving, besides the blinking of their many eyes.
Our race has moved past the need for physical speech long ago, but we know that humans have not yet evolved enough to begin using telepathy yet. So we thought that instead of forcing ourselves into your minds, which can be painful and even uncomfortable to some, you would be more comfortable if we spoke through this body.
She turned with those puppet-like movements and gestured to the 6 avian watchers. Georgina licked her lips and swallowed a few times, trying to get enough moisture in her mouth to speak.
Is she alive? Natalia, I mean.
Her body, in a way. We have kept her for many years, and it was her that confirmed to us that we would be genetically compatible with your race. Natalia has been vital to our research, but she has been with us for a very long time, and her physical body is not suited to being kept in stasis for so long. Her mind? Yes and no. But we have quieted what is left of her to speak to you. We even retrieved her old garments before you arrived, so you would be more comfortable seeing her.
Natalia was so emaciated that Georgina couldn't tell if her eye sockets were empty or if the eyeball was just desiccated. It made her stomach roll, not knowing where to look when she spoke.
So, all of you are in her?
It is difficult with this limited form of communication to explain, but to make it as simple as possible, we can function as a hive mind when necessary. We only have one human to work with to speak through, so for convenience, we are functioning as a single being.
Wait a second.
She turned to her companions.
She's speaking German, right?
Francois narrowed his eyes.
No, French.
Russian.
Tatyana answered with wonder in her voice. She no longer clung to Georgina, and there was something bordering on awe written in her features.
Tatyana is correct.
Alexei huffed.
It makes sense, considering I am the one they called for.
Incorrect.
Natalia crackled, tilting her too heavy head.
Perception is a funny thing, isn't it? We speak to you all in the language with which you are most comfortable.
Incredible.
Alexei breathed, his words revenant. Georgina thought that he was seconds away from falling to his knees and crawling towards the silent, watching creatures looming over them.
You 4 are here because you will be the very first to fulfill the purpose of your entire species.
Natalia continued, paying no mind to Alexei.
It took some trial and error, which is why the first group, including the original occupant of this body, was destroyed more or less. But you have proved much more resilient.
She tries to smile, and it's like the rictus of a skull, crazed and terrible.
You may approach the altar, and we will make everything clear to you.
Alexei, still in front of them, began to move forward, but Francois barked a quick
Stop!
At him before turning his attention back to Natalia.
We will not do that. Tell us what we need to know for Natalia.
The wraith continued to grin.
The details of the truth are too convoluted and complicated to express through this human body. We must have access to your minds. Approach the altar, please, and you will understand all.
I will.
Alexei insists.
I came to you when you called me. Across so much distance. I have heard you for years. Don't concern yourself with them. I will hear you.
Your part is played.
Natalia tells him.
You have delivered them, and now you should be silent. There is no need for only one of you.
The Russian looks like he's been struck, whipping his head back to look at the rest of his crew, and then at the creators again.
They won't understand the way I will.
He pressed.
I've been waiting for so long. Please, please, tell me why you've called me here. Tell me my purpose.
Enough.
Natalia told him again, before waving the rest of the crew forward with her puppet-like movements.
All of you at once. Approach the altar.
Disgusted, Alexei looked back at the rest of them once more. He had that look of crazed fanaticism, Georgina thought, and she knew then that he would turn on them at any time if it meant getting in the good graces of the creators.
Do it,
the Russian man hissed.
What are you waiting for?
Francois looks at the two women and shakes his head once, concisely. Georgina didn't need the confirmation from him, though. She wasn't going to go, no matter what anyone had to say about it, least of all Alexei. She wasn't sure why, but deep inside she knew that this wasn't a save the human race mission, the way she had been led to believe. The creators didn't open their mouths to speak, or even move all that much, but there was something about the way they looked at them, a hunger that she didn't trust. Alexei had finally had enough of waiting. Every second they didn't do as they were told and move forward, he seemed to get more and more agitated, clutching at his head and wringing his hands. When it became obvious that no one else was going to go with him, he cursed and pushed forward, past Natalia, and approached the altar of his own accord. Natalia did nothing to stop him, but she found it unlikely that the shell of a woman was able to move that fast anyway. Alexei was on a warpath, and just like she had predicted, once he reached the altar upon which the creators were all seated, he fell to his knees and spread his arms out. It was a position she had seen as a child in church, when sinners would pray for salvation at the feet of robed priests, but simply being in this place, having experienced what she had in the past 12 hours, made Georgina more sure than ever that those prayers were just as useless as whatever Alexei was trying to do.
I can tell you everything you want to know about humanity,
he blathered, heedless of the way the creator closest to him was slowly rising to his clawed feet.
I will do anything you ask of me. I've spent years researching the Deliverers and doing everything in my power to reach you. I will be your greatest asset. Please.
The creator, now standing at his full height, a set of dark robes flowing around his frame, swept the man up by his neck without an ounce of effort. Alexei made a few strangled sounds, clawing at the digits around his throat, but the creator wasted no time in throwing him aside until the man's body skidded against the tiled ground, coming to a stop at Francois' feet. The Frenchman sneered at first, but reluctantly knelt and tried to help Alexei to his feet. Alexei didn't move, but a low, pained groan let them all know that he hadn't perished just yet. Tatyana gasped beside her, and Georgina's own stomach rolled when she watched the creature pay the injured Russian man's still body no mind, before turning his four-eyed gaze back at them. His movements were subtle, but predatory, and it made her blood run cold. Then, as if boneless, Natalia fell to the ground as well, her legs buckling and her body hitting hard. What was left of the woman drew in a huge, shuddering breath that Georgina heard rattle in her chest and then she tried to rise, an all-too-human sob clawing its way out of her. For one horrible second, Georgina was sure it was the real Natalia inhabiting her body once more. But in a movement that was both a blessing and a murder, the creator walked forward and crushed her skull beneath his taloned feet like he hadn't even seen her. Nothing more than an ant. The others started to move, in that unnerving way, the shifting of their bodies and their heads cocking side to side. But they didn't rise. Francois was murmuring to Aleksei, trying to get him to stand, but it was slow going. Still, it was easier to watch the two of them than to look at the destroyed body of Natalia, or to contemplate how much of her had been left there at the end. It was like a flash, as quick as a finger snap, and she felt like her skull was being split in two. Before, it had been her thoughts alone in her head, but then it felt like someone else was trying to force their way in, push her consciousness to the side, and make room for themselves. Her vision blinked out, and then back, the pressure on the back of her eyeballs unbearable. But finally, the new occupant of her head was in, and the speaking began.
This becomes tedious. Speaking through the one called Natalia was not getting across what we needed you to hear. So this is the only way.
She could barely crack her eyelids open to see Francois, Aleksei, and Tatyana in just as much agony as she was. But now that they had broken her enough to get inside, the pain abated little by little. She had to remember to breathe, had to make it a conscious effort, because her entire mind was wrapped up in its invader, and even those most basic processes were interrupted.
Now that we have you here, as the first of your species to come to us mentally and physically whole, it is our duty to enlighten you on the reality of your existence. You may have thought that your evolution and progress were a result of your own merit and hard work, but in truth, it was all part of our plan. The way that your species has flourished has all been part of the framework that we set into place all those millions of years ago. Now, it's finally time for us to reap the benefits of seeding your planet. We allow you to evolve to a certain level of intelligence and to have a certain level of independence. But the truth is that you have belonged to us all along. Your genetic identity is nothing but a resource for us to harvest, to further our knowledge and evolution. And it is the same for all intelligent races that have come from the seeds we planted. You humans, though, will serve a purpose so unique that it is almost divine in nature. You see, through your very DNA, you will save our race. And since we are the genesis of intelligent life itself, you will be saving, in essence, the very fabric of life in our universe. Don't be mistaken. It will not be an easy thing for your planet or your people, and the price will seem almost too steep. But it is all by design. Our actions are not malevolent, but rather a necessity for our own survival, and therefore the progress of every other intelligent species that exists. We are a superior species,
and it is our duty to not only bring the lesser races like yours under our control, but to continue to create life where there is none. Without the beautiful, ultimate sacrifice of the human race, we cannot continue to create. Humans will be remembered as the most important martyrs in all the history of our universe. You may find our perspective jarring, or even cruel, but it is merely a matter of your limited understanding. We possess a level of intelligence and superiority that you can only dream of. But, in a way, once you have been sacrificed, you will be part of us too. It will be an ascension that other races will only ever dream of. So embrace your role as an oblation to the creators, for it is through your submission that we shall continue to grow and evolve into a superior species beyond your comprehension. This is the reality of your existence, and you are powerless to escape it. You are nothing but a mere pawn in our grand scheme, a tool to further our own evolution. But in your subjugation, you will become more than the sum of your parts. Your history, more than the sum of all of humanity.
Even though they spoke so loudly in her head, the actual square was silent. But it wasn't until the creators had finished their diatribe that Georgina was able to concentrate on anything but their words. Now that they were silent again, they still didn't pull out of her mind, but just sat there, waiting, like a coiled snake. The quiet reverberated against the walls of her skull, like the echoes off a brick wall. The first sound to penetrate her consciousness was the weeping of Aleksei, but when she looked down at where he still knelt, his face looked rapturous instead of horrified. Georgina was still trying to process what they had all just been told, but even after being thrown like a rag doll, Alexei still couldn't shake the worshipful feelings he had towards the creators.
So, we are what? Trial runs?
She manages to force out. Her teeth feel like they're clenched shut, jaw fighting against her to work.
In a way, yes. The knowledge of the inner workings of your world will be invaluable to us. But we also need to be absolutely sure that your race is the genetic match we need before we begin the harvesting. There may be times that having a human form may be useful as well. And poor Natalia had obviously decayed too much to be of any use.
Anything you want from me, I am here,
Alexei swears, clasping his hands in front of his face pathetically.
I am your vessel.
And what if we don't cooperate?
Francois speaks up. Although the creators still haven't spoken out loud yet, they seem to be amused by this idea. A dry, clicking sound emanating from them.
I thought it had been made perfectly clear that we can take control of you as we please. All of this will be much easier and cleaner if you just cooperate. Come forward now. Let us end this pointless little rebellion.
As expected, Alexei limped forward, clearly injured from his earlier instance of being tossed, but no one else moved. Tatyana wrapped both of her arms around Georgina's one, not out of fear, but just for that human connection, and Georgina too was thankful for it. Francois watched Aleksei go with a disgusted look on his face behind his helmet, but said nothing else.
Come.
The words rumbled in her head, so strongly that she thought she might be able to physically feel them.
Now.
You'll have to make us.
Georgina growled. She refused to have her last moments on this mortal coil to be spent begging, even if it meant her legs shook with her efforts to hold her terror down.
We will do no such thing.
If she hadn't seen the way Natalia moved before, it may have taken Georgina longer to pinpoint what was wrong with Alexei when he whipped around and stalked towards them with uncomfortable speed. The herky-jerky movements of his limbs set off alarms in her head immediately, but it was too late. Her own reactions too sluggish. Alexei grabbed Tatyana roughly, one hand bare and the other still gloved from where his suit had been scraped to hell on the tile. The other woman yelped and held fast to Georgina's arm, but like a car with the governor removed, Alexei wasn't encumbered by his brain's limitations anymore. The entity piloting his body didn't care if it destroyed him in the process of forcing Tatyana away, only that the command was done. He ripped her away from Georgina so hard that Georgina was wrenched forward, one knee hitting the ground with a resounding crack that rattled her to her teeth, while her other leg tried to keep her upright. She got a look at Alexei's face, slack like a corpse as he moved his bare hand up to grab one of Tatyana's, still clutching Georgina, and squeezed the gloved appendage with unbelievable force. Georgina heard the girl's bones crack one breath before she screamed, and in her panic, let go of Georgina with her good hand too. It was chaos. Alexei dragging a screaming Tatyana towards the stone-still creator that was still standing. Georgina struggled to her feet, the pain in her knee pulsing angrily through her, and lurched towards the two Russians, drawing her laser pistol. It was Francois quietly saying wait that held her there, watching with her heart in her throat.
God, I'm so weak,
she thought, angry tears pricking at the corner of her eyes.
How could I have let him take her?
As Alexei deposited Tatyana on the ground at the standing creator's feet, where she curled around her broken hand in agony, the rest of the creators began to rise from their seats in perfect unison. Each movement was slow and deliberate, as if time itself was being stretched to its limit. They moved with an almost mechanical precision, the sound of their steps hushed despite their size. Georgina felt a chill run down her spine as the creators formed a semicircle around them. Their bodies towered over the humans, casting long shadows over the floor. Their faces were devoid of emotion, giving them an eerie and robotic appearance, besides the seemingly random blinking of their eyes and the slight tilting of their heads. As the creators stood silently, Georgina could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She wondered if this was the end, if it had all been for nothing. In that sacred, ancient place, she felt no awe or gratitude for seeing life beyond Earth, but only a sickening sense of loss. The air was heavy with tension, and the only sound was Tatyana's faint, miserable cries. Then the humming began, emanating from somewhere within the creators' feathered throats. She didn't know what it was at first, but there was an energy rolling off Francois that she had never felt before. He stood tall, with his shoulders back, but it almost felt like he was shredding grief off of himself with every breath, like it was so all-encompassing that it was bleeding over onto her too. Francois stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the towering figures of the creators. She was frozen, shock finally starting to settle over her, but her crewmate didn't falter. Silently, she watched him undo the fastening on his left glove, sliding the covering off and letting it fall to the ground as he spoke.
Listen to me.
Francois said, his voice ringing out in the stillness. He held up his uncovered hand, still holding it in a fist.
Samyaza, some type of rebel, gave me the means with which to end all of this. And I will.
He opened his fist, and she had to repress her gasp at what she saw. His entire palm was blackened, veins of blackness running up his arms like the branches of a tree, all stemming from a gray shard of stone embedded in the center of his hand. The creators began to murmur amongst themselves, audibly, for the first time, their strange voices sending shivers down Georgina's spine. But Francois was undeterred.
I will stay behind willingly,
he continued, his gaze unwavering.
If you will let Georgina and Tatyana return to Earth.
The air grew thicker as the creators hesitated, unsure of what to do. But Francois was resolute, holding his left hand out for them to see. The tiny gray stone shimmered gold in the dim light, a promise of destruction hanging in the air.
It's a shard of a deliverer,
she realized, finally putting all the pieces together. After what seemed like an eternity, one of the creators stepped forward. It towered over Francois, its beady eyes fixed on the miniature promise of destruction he held.
Very well,
it said, its voice low and rumbling, even in their minds.
They may go, but know this, human. The very moment they are gone, we take your arm. Don't think we don't recognize what you hold.
Francois nodded solemnly.
I am already offering you my life. So what do I care if you take my arm?
No!
Georgina spat. Tatyana echoed the sentiment, shaking her head vehemently.
We're not going to leave you here! Are you crazy? Make them let us all go! They aren't going to risk dying to keep you, Francois.
He turned to her, and his smile was soft, despite everything.
Take care of my wife and children, Georgina. Tell them that I love them, and I would have done anything to make it back to them, if there was a way to do so, while still keeping them safe. But it isn't meant to be.
Denial welled up in her throat, threatening to choke her.
No, don't make me do this.
Take Tatyana and go, Georgina. Tell our story.
He looked back toward the two Russians and scowled.
But leave Alexei. He has proven time and time again where his loyalties lie.
Our patience is not infinite.
Francois took her by the shoulder with one hand and looked into Georgina's eyes, trying to convey all the million things he wanted to tell her with just a glance. She could never know what it was he needed from her. Exactly. But time was melting away, and he had given her a means to get Tatyana to safety. She couldn't waste it. He didn't want her to. She nodded once, tightly, and without another word, Georgina rushed forward to collect Tatyana off the ground. Whispering words of comfort, she helped the woman stand and approach the deliverer, which glowed stronger the closer they got to it.
It will take them to Earth, yes?
Francois asked the creators.
Yes, as long as there is no interruption.
Georgina paused, looking at Alexei one last time, in the deadness of his eyes.
He wanted this,
she thought, trying to shake off the guilt of leaving him.
There's nothing I can do.
There was a ringing in her ears as she all but pulled Tatyana to the deliverer. Without even as much as a glance towards Francois, she knew in her bones what he meant to do. It scared her, but at the same time filled her with a fierce, twisted joy. The two women hovered their hands over the deliverer, nerves making both of them quiver. Tatyana cradled her hand against her chest, but besides biting her bottom lip to the point of bruising, she showed no indication of the pain now. Sucking in air like a bellows, Georgina gathered her strength and looked at Francois, her friend, one last time. He met her eyes, and in his, she saw eternity. Her mouth twisted in a bitter, triumphant smile.
Rain hell.
He swallowed hard.
Oui.
When her hand touched the stone of the deliverer, time stretched, and the last thing Georgina saw before she was pulled away was Alexei lunging towards Francois. But even as the Russian took the Frenchman down, Francois closed his eyes in a sort of blissful reverie, closed his fist on the deliverer's shard in a punishing grip, and let himself be taken down. Blood seeped between his closed fingers, and reality began to shatter. But as soon as the swirling portal opened in Francois's left hand, Georgina felt her stomach drop with a sickening lurch. The air around them crackled with energy, and the ground shook beneath their feet. Suddenly, they were no longer in the crumbling community square on the alien planet. Instead, just like before, Georgina felt herself pulled apart at the seams of her very molecular structure, a nebulous thing that recombined in a nauseating thunderclap that left her reeling, and the alarms on her suit screaming. She wasn't in freefall, but on top of something squishy and organic, surrounded by a thick, green-yellow gas cloud. Something was horribly wrong. The blaring of her and Tatyana's suits screaming a warning. Georgina's heart raced as she looked around, realizing that whatever they were on was floating, and there was no ground below them at all. Her vision hadn't adjusted, but she didn't fight Tatyana when the other woman put her good hand on Georgina's helmet and turned it just slightly. Hovering there above the clot-colored thing they were sitting on was the deliverer. They both dove for it, and that time, the disintegrating of her being was almost a relief.
Surely, this time we'll get home.
Then they were jolted again, and the gas planet disappeared entirely, replaced by a barren, radioactive wasteland. Acidic heat pressed against her flesh, even through the suit. But even more alarming was the way that Tatyana was clawing at her neck. Georgina could see the terror in her eyes as she struggled to keep breathing. But like before, the deliverer hung in the air just out of reach. She pushed her suffocating friend towards it, and once Tatyana blipped out of existence, Georgina grabbed the orb too and was gone once more. She was nothing, and then she was Georgina again. They were in a void, floating in space with no atmosphere around them. And still, Georgina's suit alarms blared. There was no telling if her suit, or Tatyana's, was compromised at that point, considering the trauma they had been put through, and a fear of her blood boiling had Georgina whipping her body around to try to find their way out. Tatyana was closer to the deliverer this time, but that also allowed Georgina the chance to get a good look at the other woman's face. She was bone white, pupils pinpricks. If they didn't get to Earth soon, the Russian woman wasn't going to make it. That time, when Georgina laid her hands on the deliverer, it was only after Tatyana put her weight behind it, pushing it through the empty air as she disappeared. The final destination was the worst of all. They were standing on a planet with crushing gravity, and Georgina felt as if she was being pulled in 100 different directions at once. She struggled to move, her body feeling like lead as she desperately tried to adjust her suit to the extreme pressure. Through it all, Georgina could hear Tatyana's ragged breathing over the comms, and she knew they were both terrified. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, they were jolted once more. Maybe it was how exhausted, how absolutely spent she was, or how intense the pain racking on her the last planet had become. But Georgina didn't even register reaching the deliverer the last time. 1 second she was there, and the next she wasn't. It was a rougher transfer that time. Instead of separating into her atomic parts in an instant, Georgina felt like she was being pulled into pieces, molecule by molecule. She wasn't floating in nothingness, but being pulled through something as thick as molasses, and it felt so futile that she wanted to cry, had it been possible.
At least it doesn't hurt here,
she thought, trying to rationalize letting herself die there in the in-between. But then she heard another voice, an impossible one, and saw in her mind's eye a gruff, smirking face.
Almost there, kid,
Mark Kirby told her from somewhere in the ether.
I've got you. We're almost there.
The first thing she saw was sweet, buttery yellow sunshine and the rolling expanse of soft green grass. Georgina collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her face as she wrenched her helmet off her head and gasped for air. She looked up at the sky, feeling overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. They had made it back, against all odds. She rose up on her elbow and helped one-handed Tatyana get her helmet off as well, sweeping the younger woman's sweaty hair off her forehead and kissing her once, a ferocious proclamation of life, before she fell to the ground once more with an audible thud. There were sunbeams on her skin, and they were warm. Georgina was quiet, letting her eyelids flutter closed as she simply breathed in the glorious air. Her mind was foggy, but that couldn't be said for her companion. She heard Tatyana laugh, a thread of insanity in it, before the false mirth dissolved into sobs, and finally, screams of rage and grief. Georgina understood. She felt those things too, but she wasn't ready to process it all yet. She was alive, and if the amount of air Tatyana was sucking into her lungs to howl was any indication, she was too. They were going to make it, and that was enough. It had to be enough. She woke up in a cold sweat, but then again she always did. Even when she slept, there was a part of her that never really rested, a part of her that was always waking, but at the same time, dead. Tatyana looked out the bedroom window at the Eiffel Tower in the distance. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. She was thinking about Francois, the sacrifice he made, and the life she and Georgina had built since returning to Earth. Her heart felt heavy as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, flexing her now healed hand that still hurt her when the rest of the city was dark. France was never where she planned to settle, but the two women felt drawn there once they returned, for one reason. Well, two actually. Elizabeth and Marie Leblanc. They had been anonymously supporting Francois' family since their return to Earth, sending money and gifts to help them rebuild their lives. Tatyana has suggested it as a way to honor Francois' memory and to ease their own guilt, even if they both knew deep down that no amount of money would repair that which had been broken. Rolling on her side, she looked at the sleeping woman and the wrinkle of tension between her eyebrows even when she was at rest, and reached out one permanently twisted finger to soothe the line away. Of course, she was grateful for Georgina's presence, even when things were strained. They had been through so much together, and the experience had left an indelible mark on both of them. It was as if the events on the distant planet had forever altered their personalities, leaving them with a deep sense of sadness and loss that they could never fully shake off. Georgina, once so confident and self-assured, now seemed hesitant and uncertain about everything. Tatyana knew that the experience had taken a toll on her, leaving her with a profound sense of anxiety that would probably never go away. It was a flaw they both shared, and it was an unspoken fact between them that without the other, there wouldn't be enough of them to make a complete person. Georgina and Tatyana were two broken things, never quite fitting together fully, but enough to stop each other from crumbling. The memories of their traumatic journey still haunted her every waking moment, both in their thoughts and in the real, tangible world. Dr. Maxwell had been calling and sending letters from the very moment they settled in their new home, all but begging and promising to place riches at their feet, if only they would gift their expertise with the deliverer to his program once more. Georgina always found some catharsis by burning every missive that they would receive from him in the mail, but watching the flames always left Tatyana feeling hollow. Despite being back on Earth, she and Georgina couldn't shirk the sense of unease that had settled deep within them. Often Tatyana would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, reliving the terror of being trapped in the crushing gravity of that third planet. Other times, she would be gripped by a sudden panic attack, feeling as if she was suffocating in the vacuum of space. The memories of each planet they had passed through were etched into her mind like scars, refusing to fade, no matter how hard she tried to forget. And yet, what scared Tatyana the most was how different she and Georgina had become since returning to Earth. They were close before leaving for the moon, but their relationship had been new then. It shouldn't have held up to the crucible of their time with the creators, but instead of cracking, they had come together like steel forged in fire. Yet, there was a distance between them that she couldn't quite explain. They rarely talked about what had happened, as if acknowledging it would somehow make it more real, more present in their lives. Tatyana couldn't help but wonder if they were both slowly unraveling, succumbing to some unseen force that had been unleashed. They had survived, yes, but at what cost? Every day was a struggle, a battle against the memories that threatened to overwhelm them, and yet they soldiered on, keeping their pain hidden from the world, carrying the weight of their experience like a burden that never lifted. In the end, all they had left was the anonymous support they provided for Francois' family, a constant reminder of the price they had paid for their journey through the unknown, and the hope, the prayer, that whatever Francois did was able to cut off the creators from Earth forever. Tatyana closed her eyes, tears welling up as she silently prayed that they would one day find peace, that they would be able to move on from the horrors that still haunted them. But deep down, doubt ran through her veins. Always. And just like every night before, as sleep began to pull her under, the chanting echoed in her ears.